Welcome to the Morbid Moonlight Monthly Update.
Alright everybody, how's things with you all? Hope all is good. My name is Alex and welcome to the third episode of the Month in Horror podcast thing, where I will be rooting through the latest new horror releases, chatting about them, giving you my thoughts and a rating out of 5 stars, and then at the end of all that I'll be doing a rundown of all my rankings from the worst film of the month to the best. As ever, if you can't be bothered sitting through the whole thing because you've got better things to do with your life, then you can just skip to that end bit if you want the ranking rundown, where I'll be giving my thoughts in capsule form and ranking each of the month's releases. Of course, you probably noticed that this episode of the Month in Horror is now officially later than ever, for which I can only apologise. In my head, I sort of aim for the last day of the month to release each episode, as in the May episode should drop on the 31st of May, but somehow it just never works out, and usually what happens is it'll trundle out a few days later. I'll always try to fit in as many films as I can, obviously within reason, and there's always more things that I can be doing, but just this month, stuff got in the way. You know what it's like. If you want to peek behind the curtains, let me tell you this. Usually what I do is I do the show in parts, record a few reviews each week in one sitting, then edit the 4 parts of that together. Well, this month I was doing fine until the very last week when I just started feeling really shitty, which you'll probably be able to tell from my voice right now. Not that you care, nor do I expect you to, but I'm just telling you that in case you wonder why my voice drops for some of the later reviews. Obviously this month the big talking point is the latest Saw movie, Spiral from the Book of Saw, my first big theatrical horror release of the year. There'll be plenty to talk about with that, and we've also got Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead, which might sound like it takes place in the George Romero universe, but it doesn't. Along with the big releases, there's also the usual bunch of oddball stuff, including films from South Africa, Thailand, and of course, the wonderful country of Canada. There's also the long-awaited third film in the Tooth Fairy franchise, The Tooth Fairy, The Last Extraction. I'll bet you just cannot fucking wait, can you? Just a quick something that I thought I would mention. There's a few slightly iffy release dates for certain big horror films. This whole kind of UK versus US release date thing, where the release dates are different in different countries. For example, The Conjuring 3 is available in the UK this month, but doesn't release in the US until next month. Though I've had the chance to squeeze them in, I've decided to postpone both The Conjuring 3 and A Quiet Place Part 2 until the next episode, just because I think it'll work out better than if I shoved them in late in the day, and that would mean having to delay the whole thing even more. So if you're waiting for those films, you will have to hang on until next episode, but I promise that I'll cover them both in detail then. We'll keep this bit short and sweet for now because there's a lot to get through. I've been a little bit more selective this month than I have been previously, although whether that's benefited me or not, you'll have to wait and see. There's certainly a few titles I've skipped just because after last month's 20 film blowout, I felt the need to kind of rein things back in a bit. I know with a film like Spiral, that's part of a huge franchise that I haven't spoken about before, but I've got a lot of thoughts and opinions about, then I would have the chance to go a lot more in depth than I would if I was reviewing a dozen forgettable micro-budget train wrecks. Ideally, the more big films there are to talk about, the longer those reviews, the less overall films I'll be talking about per month, just because I'm aware that there's only so long this podcast can be before it just gets ridiculous. I mean, it's already crazy long, isn't it? So let's just get stuck in, shall we? If there are any reviews in particular that you want to listen to rather than just wading through the whole thing, then there are timestamps in the description below, where you'll also get to see a complete list of all the films we're talking about this episode. Feel free to jump about as you see fit, but if you're not doing that, then let's start at the beginning and just dive straight in to the May 2021 edition of The Month in Horror, now officially later than ever.
People like me and you cut out for this job, Others, they can't stomach it. Headquarters coming down on me.
I figured we'd be having this talk.
I feel like you weren't ready, and quite honestly, I think I may have made a mistake in thinking that you are.
What are you saying?
They want you to go in for a full psych evaluation. Gets better. And then they're going to put you behind a desk for a while.
A desk?
Well, between the accident and you not being ready, it's just talk for now.
No, Joe, I belong in the field. I save lives. I run into shit that other people can't handle. You're going to stick me behind a fucking desk?
It's not me. Come on, I went to bat for you. They overruled me. Well, reach out to your rep.
No. You tell them to shove their psych eval up their asses.
So let's kick things off with a movie by the name of Blue Call, released on the 4th of May. Now, Blue Call is a film set in the very real world of the EMT, dealing with the horrors that go along with that particular line of work. We follow our lead Hayley, played by Katie LeClaire, who you might know from The Big Bang Theory, where she played Raj's girlfriend Emily for a few years, and Hayley is suffering from the after effects of something traumatic that happened to her on the job. Out on the streets, Hayley gets a momentous call one night when she arrives at the scene of an attempted suicide. The victim is actually a well-known drag artist by the name of William Belly, and she is begged to end the victim's life. Desperate and low herself, Hayley agrees to terminate the drag queen's life, and before long she finds herself developing a reputation as a woman willing to do the unthinkable, and she's called out to perform illegal euthanasia on various people in the city. Oh, and there's also a killer knocking about who might be after her. It's pretty serious stuff for a horror film to deal with, you might be thinking. Well, it certainly skates nearer to the drama thriller side of things than it does out-and-out horror, but there's definitely a fair share of pretty horrific moments. And it's a pretty touchy, pretty raw issue for a lot of people who know people who have suffered long and protracted deaths, and the question of whether or not it's right that you should be able to kill someone that's suffering, if it's what they want, should be the subject of a lot of raw, emotional drama. But somehow, Blue Call just really doesn't do these issues justice. I think that the best way to describe Blue Call is to say that it's structurally and thematically very similar to the Soska sisters movie American Mary. In that particular movie, Catherine Isabel's character Mary went around dispensing black market body modification to people that conventional doctors wouldn't touch. And there's the whole subtext there about indulging fringe behaviours and cutting free from the boundaries of what society deemed as acceptable in order to embrace your own identity. Blue Call is like a version of American Mary, except that instead of dishing out weird body mods, our lead is going around euthanizing people that society won't allow to die. Even the fact that our lead pals about with a sex and drugs obsessed small-time gangster and gets clients via underworld connections feels very American Mary-like. Now, American Mary is a really interesting film, even if it does have a few flaws. It does end up getting a little too nasty and messy for its own good, but Blue Call is like someone has traced the outline of American Mary, then filled in that framework with a lot of stuff that doesn't quite fit. For one thing, it's one of those films that really loses its way, like it kind of forgets what's going on, and it's packed with kind of random scenes that don't do anything other than fill up time, that always make me think that someone's looked at the movie, realised it was underrunning, then gone, let's shove in a few extra scenes that don't advance the plot any, but are just our characters hanging out and screwing around just to get it up to 90 minutes. Out of the last half hour, at least I'd say 20 minutes of it seems like filler, which really is not the place that you want to get the feeling that nothing's happening. Secondly, there's the fact that the idea is very grim, but the plot mechanics are very simplistic, and they often seem to have little bearing on reality. Hayley continues to spin around, dishing out mercy kills for a good long time after someone should have been asking her what the fuck's going on. There's a lot of scenes that play out for maximum emotion and drama that are pretty affecting, in that watching even moderately good actors beg to be put out of their suffering can be pretty tough. I think the key line comes when someone suggests to Hayley that maybe you can get your peace by giving others theirs. That's about as on the nose as you can possibly get, and probably goes better to explaining the ethos of the movie than its official tagline does, its official tagline being your life, your solution, which makes this look way more like a killer doctor movie, which it isn't. It's downbeat and it's grim, pretty realistic and a little bit flimsy, and even though it's very cheap, I guess you can at least applaud the attempt to deal with something serious and substantial, even if there are too many scenes that just seem to pad the running time out. A word of warning though, do not watch this late at night, because it's one of those movies where most of it is very dimly lit or taking place at night time, and it moves so incredibly slowly that it's more than a little bit soporific. I think it's got good ideas, but it kind of splurges by the end and doesn't really know what to do with its basic concept, and it's a little bit too cheap to really be able to take it mega seriously, because it's got too many budgetary problems. It might sound unfair, but I'm going to have to land at epoxy 1.5 stars for Blue Call, because it's not much fun. Not that it's meant to be. It's just too half-hearted to be able to buy into it when it does get serious and grim, and it's way too long and it's way too slow. On a side note though, this is the directorial debut of director Brian Farrell, Farmer, who both writes and directs. What's interesting about it is the fact that Brian Farmer's got 2 more films already lined up in various early stages of production, those being Walking Nightmare with Diane Franklin and Running with Fear with Eric Roberts, aka the man with the most fucking insane amount of credits ever. Currently, he's got over 600 roles over the years, which is just fucking nuts. I mean, neither of these 2 films have a scheduled release date yet, but chances are we'll be seeing more Brian Farmer movies in the months to come. I can't say I'm hugely excited by the prospect, but you gotta give the guy kudos for ploughing on ahead nonetheless.
What are you doing there?
It's a surprise. Were you, like, chanting or something?
Chanting? No, I was just singing while I worked. Sorry, I do that.
What is that?
Oh, wow. It's beautiful. Oh, and it smells so good. Thank you. Black moonstone for new beginnings. Amethyst and malachite for empowerment of female energies and wisdom. Spices and feathers to lift our desires in the air like incense lifts prayers.
So now I'm going to do something a bit different, which is I'm going to talk about a film that goes by the name of Don't Let Her In, which was released in 2 parts. First part dropped end of April, second part dropped start of May. So to some extent this isn't purely a May release, but we'll get to that later on. So there's this problem I've been having lately, which has all got to do with the latest output from the notorious ultra low budget studio by the name of Full Moon Pictures. You might be familiar with Full Moon's oeuvre, as they've been in the filmmaking game since the end of the 80s, start of the 90s. If you're not, then let me fill you in briefly on what Full Moon is all about. Full Moon is a low-budget studio that makes movies of, shall we say, questionable merit. As much as it pains me to say it, I don't think there's a single great Full Moon movie, but they've coasted along over the years on having developed a kind of cult following, mainly amongst horror fans, that most forgiving of audiences. Full Moon has been kept alive by the enthusiasm of one Charles Band, and if you're not familiar with Charles Band, then basically imagine him as the Stan Lee figure of Full Moon. This publicity-hungry maestro who's always keen to pump out as much product as possible, who's half ultra-shrewd businessman and half infectiously enthusiastic fanboy. Without this frenetic figurehead, it's likely that the studio would have long since fallen by the wayside, but as I've said, Charles Band Esquire is one savvy cat, and he knows the tricks of staying alive in a harsh market environment. He started off making these fairly legit little horror movies like Puppet Master and Subspecies before falling into a rut as the guy who made movies about little creatures, and Full Moon went from being slightly kitschy but fun to silly and self-referential over the years. The end point of this came with movies like The Ginger Dead Man, which is of course Gary Busey reincarnated Chucky style into the body of a gingerbread man that goes full psycho, and the insanely huge Evil Bong franchise. At the moment the studio turns out stoner fantasy horror movies like the crossover Ginger Weed Man and weird softcore sex romps like Femalian, and it's hard to see what the studio's output has to offer to the casual viewer anymore. I think Full Moon's totally lost that market. Modern day Full Moon has become closeted away in its own weird little place, and now it's one of those institutions that most people probably think died with video rental shops, where Full Moon movies were at their height of popularity, although it is debatable just how popular Full Moon movies ever were, and kind of how much of the furore around their stuff in the 90s was just clever marketing for substandard products. Personally, I think Charles Band was more interested in selling stuff than in actually taking the time to make movies that were worth selling. Personally, I still stick by Full Moon because I like to support the little guy, and if the prospect of a new Full Moon movie isn't so much, I wonder if it'll be as good as they used to be, because I don't ever think Full Moon has turned out anything better than some slightly above average movies, stuff like Dark Angel, The Descent, Puppet Master 3, some of the later Killjoy movies are quite fun. It's more a case of checking in with an old friend that you used to hang out with and sort of marvelling at how little they're doing with their lives. But in a way, I like the fact that there's something slightly anachronistic about the whole full moon experience, spiced up with whatever gimmick Charles Band can think of. He's had a live stream behind the scenes of the movie Shoot, for example, lately with the Deadly 10 thing. You know you're never going to be blown away by a full moon movie, but there's something slightly reassuring about the fact that they're still puttering along doing their own thing. What I do have more of a problem with is the way that they've been releasing movies lately. Rather than dropping exclusives, what they've been doing is taking one new movie a month and splitting it into 2 parts or 2 chapters and releasing each chapter a week apart. I mean, full moon movies were never long, usually in the sort of hour to sort of 60 to 70 minute mark, but splitting them into 2 does seem a pretty desperate move. What you could say is meant to create a sense of anticipation or whatever, the reality is actually pretty cynical. When they do choose to drop a new movie, what they do is stick the first half in at the end of one month, then have the second half at the start of the next month. Why do they do this? Because they're a streaming service and they sell their streaming service in monthly packages. Therefore, if you want a full new movie, then there's going to be none of this 1 month free trial then cancel it before you have to pay business. You want to catch a new full moon movie, then you're going to have to be around for at least 2 months. Those of you familiar with the company will probably now be nodding and saying, yeah, that is so Charles Band right now. And in a way, you'd be right. In his defence, however, there is a pretty solid offer on the yearly subscriptions to Full Moon streaming, involving a free 12 Blu-ray box set of the first 11 Puppet Master movies for subscribers who choose to strap in for a whole year of Full Moon. However, the problem has been one of my own making, which is this. If Full Moon are dropping new movies with Part 1 released 1 month and Part 2 the next month, then I'm not ever going to be in a position to talk about their movies. This is the month in horror, after all, even though it's a pretty arbitrary distinction. I actually wanted to talk about their From Beyond sequel, The Resonator, in the March episode, but it just didn't pan out. The thing is, even though they're released in parts, they're still movies, not series, not mini-series at the end of the day. So it would be stupid to talk about each chapter individually. So I figured that the best thing to do would be to do what I'm now doing, which is reviewing Don't Let Her In as a whole movie by taking its release date as being the point at which it was possible for me to see the whole movie in its entirety, which in this case was May the 7th. So that's a lot of preamble, just because I thought it was worth mentioning, as I have not spoken about Full Moon on this podcast yet, and as long as it's not softcore erotica or a stoner comedy, then I'm happy to watch whatever stuff Full Moon puts out. Sadly, about half their movies seem to be either softcore or stoner comedies at the moment. I've never understood why they don't put more effort into doing full-blown horror stuff, because it's clearly their horror movies that they're best known for, and the horror fandom is the best place, maybe even the only place, where you're likely to flog expensive collector's edition Blu-rays and box sets. If they stopped making these tacky, juvenile, non-horror movies, then I think they'd get more of an audience. I really do. I mean, I don't mind admitting to liking the last Puppet Master movie that they did, which came out last year, which was Blade the Iron Cross, in part because it was 100% played straight, despite its tiny budget and its kind of ludicrous premise. If Charles Band wasn't in such a hurry to mock his own stuff all the time, then I think people will get more enjoyment out of his films. The reason I've spent so much time talking about Full Moon movies is that, in a way, they're a genre all by themselves. Not quite horror, not quite fantasy, often with a comedic edge and usually with very tame sex and drugs thrown in. Sometimes feeling like weird, kind of garish cartoons that you're never quite sure how in on the joke the whole production is, if things are tacky and unconvincing on purpose or not. Chances are, if you've seen a few Full Moon movies, you can spot them in a crowd, but if you haven't seen one, then it's quite a hard thing to describe. It's also very hard to get somebody that didn't grow up with Full Moon movies at some stage of their youth to get excited about them, and there's always that feeling of maybe you really just had to have been there the first time around. I wonder how many new fans are attracted to Full Moon through their current output, because it can't be very many, but still they keep on doing their thing. But anyway, let's get to the job at hand. Released on May the 7th in full, Don't Let Her In seems to be one of Full Moon's first attempts to make a serious horror thriller with no connections to any of their existing properties, and for that reason alone I think it's a movie that's worth talking about. The plot is pretty simple, given that the combined runtime of both chapters of the movie is under an hour in length. We've got a cool, laid-back couple who take in a lodger to make some money, a female lodger I should say, and she turns out to be, ultimately, a demon that has designs on the two of them, simplicity itself. It's one of those throwbacks throwback erotic thrillers of the single white female type about a sexy newcomer shaking up the couple's domestic malaise, with a lot of psychosexual tension and a couple of steamy moments. What is interesting is that it's both very like what Modern Full Moon does and very unlike what Modern Full Moon does. It has elements of softcore and a lot of drug references and recreational drug use, complete with bumbling stoner boyfriend, but it's also a slick, legit movie, even though it does have some rough edges. Don't Let Her In comes from the mind of director Ted Nicolau, the man behind Full Moon's gothic vampire franchise, the Subspecies films, which a lot of people say are some of the best Full Moon productions, but personally I find them a little bit slow and self-indulgent, but they are unusually stylish and serious, legit movies for Full Moon. Hopefully this won't be the last legit horror thriller that Full Moon puts out, because I'd much rather see low budget simplistic movies like this than I would more weird porno comedies, which seem to be every second movie on Full Moon's streaming library. That said, I can't honestly say Don't Let Her In is any better than just about average, but I applaud it as a step in the right direction for a studio that has always seemed unable to tell which way the wind's blowing. It's just stylish enough to lift it above the level of a mundane TV movie, but also has just enough goofiness going on to remind you that it is a Full Moon production.
What's in these, anyway? Because it makes me fart like a butt trumpet.
It's a good thing. It's your body expelling evil essences.
At under an hour long, Don't Let Me In has barely enough time to fit in 3 acts, and I think if it had been longer, it probably would have played out the drama of, is the sexy new lodger actually a demon, or is our heroine just going crazy because she's off her meds? As it is, any ambiguity is soon out the window before we've even started, making sure we know exactly what kind of a threat the black-clad lodger is, which cuts down on the potential for under-the-surface psychodrama and replaces it with demon-face prosthetics and weird speeded-up demon walking scenes. A longer, fuller version of the story would probably have opened up the cast slightly, although it's pretty impressive that the whole movie makes do with, I think, only 4 cast members. There's also a slew of Full Moon in-jokes. Our lead, Amber, designs goofy low-budget horror movie posters, her words, including one for Charles Band's movie Corona Zombies, and the characters sit around and watch Full Moon movies for giggles. In fact, the only place you will ever see people watching Full Moon films is in Full Moon films, which is a common running gag that you'll see in a lot more Full Moon movies than you would expect. But other than that, things trundle along pretty smoothly and efficiently. Ted Nicolau does know his stuff, and this seems like a simple piece of nuts and bolts filmmaking with a few nice flourishes, and it's got some could-be-better acting from a pretty likeable, if slightly too self-consciously quirky cast. I'm probably coming in higher than Don't Let Her In deserves, but as a simple, unpretentious piece of old-fashioned A to B psychodrama, I'm giving Don't Let Her In 2.5 stars out of 5. It certainly doesn't waste your time, it's perfectly fine and diverting enough, even if it doesn't have an original bone in its body. Who knows, maybe this time next year, Full Moon will be back on track, making decent horror movies again. I, for one, would certainly like to see that.
Barry, you look like you're having a cuck day, Baz. Everything all right?
It's okay.
Okay. Glad you've been having this thought all day. Barry, focus. Why do cartoons have gloves?
You tell me.
I don't know, Barry, I'm asking you. Think about it. Pinocchio, gloves is the puppet, little boy, no gloves anymore. Disney said it was because of the fingers, too hard to draw. I get that, totally. Mickey Mouse though, okay? Gloves. But in the beginning he didn't have gloves. So 1927, in Pain Crazy, like Felix the Cat, black feet, black hands, all right? 1928, Steamboat Willie had shoes for the first time. 1929, on the piano, love that scene. Fucking brilliant, right? Suddenly he had gloves. Okay? But he's not a human, is he? Okay? Is he a man?
Well, he's not a woman.
No. He's a mouse. All right? So why does he have fingers and gloves and everything else? But here's the thing that freaks me out the most, Barry. If he's a mouse, why does he have a dog? He's got Pluto. It's a dog. Now, Disney will say it's anthropomorphic, okay? Gloves make him look more human, so you can understand. But I go deeper. I think that Disney was around during vaudeville, right? So I think it was a little bit racist. I know, because I'm a little bit racist. That's why I like coming here, okay? So he would watch minstrels, black face, white gloves. What's Mickey Mouse? Black face, white gloves. Hey? Yeah.
So let's talk about a weird little movie that calls itself Fried Barry now. Fried Barry announces itself as being a Ryan Kruger thing after we've had a warning message from an overzealous censor telling us how extreme what we're about to see is going to be. Couple that with the neon stylings of the poster art and the wacky title, and what we've got is something that looks dangerously like it's going to be one of those self-styled wannabe cult movies of the kind so prevalent in the genre these days. But thankfully, that's not what Fried Barry is at all. It's the real deal. So director Ryan Kruger describes Fried Barry as being a road movie in which the person going on the trip is an alien and the vehicle is the body of a drug-addicted weirdo who goes by the name of Barry. We're introduced to Barry, who's played by Gary Green, as he shoots up, and we see his dismal home life, which is kind of like a South African accented version of those awful Rob Zombie, young Michael Myers scenes at the family dinner table in his Halloween movie, and we see some of the lowlifes he hangs about with. But the truth is, even before the weird shit happens, Barry is a pretty spaced out dude who doesn't really react to anything that's going on around him. Then he gets abducted by aliens. Cue a truly disorientating version of the famous Fire in the Sky abduction scene, only one with a lot more cock shots. The next thing we know, Barry's body is taken over by an alien consciousness, and the rest of the movie is Barry's journey through the chaotic wasteland of present-day South Africa, as he encounters a string of junkies, prostitutes, street gangs and oddballs, all seen through the unblinking eyes of an alien in a very strange man's body. So I'm going to come right out and say it. I'm not well versed in South African cinema whatsoever. I mean, I've certainly seen movies filmed in South Africa, like King Solomon's Mines, Diamond Mercenaries, Outlaw of Gore, but I think Fried Barry might be my first genuine South African movie. That's significant for a number of reasons, one of which is that for most audiences, the world of Fried Barry will seem extra bizarre and exotic. I mean, it might as well be some weird apocalyptic future for how fucked up and crazy everyone we see here is. I don't know how authentic all of this is to the real South African experience, but I'm sure that most of us can project onto the scenes of Alien Barry wandering through the city's worst areas our own experiences of the seediest and filthiest kind of places that pop up in big cities. Although this South Africa has some of the truly jaw-dropping sleaziness that you'd get in 70s movies set in New York, only it's got a genuine offbeat energy to it all, rather than that utter despair you get from the likes of something like Taxi Driver. And that kind of energy runs through the whole movie. It's not the kind of film you can describe in any real detail, except to say that it's as much experience as it is a narrative. It's a film that bounces about from one thing to the next in a way that feels organic rather than episodic. It's shot through with a crazy kind of dream illogicality, not dream logic because things don't progress logically, but rather they simply flow into one another. The soundtrack's great, and Ryan Kruger, making his directorial debut amazingly, has a real eye for the bizarre. I mean, you just need to look at his choice of leading man for that. Gary Green is wonderful. He's got one of those faces that just invites you to project a whole life's worth of experience onto it, like a gnarly, finely etched wood cutting. It's the kind of face that you'd find in a classic Italian movie that somebody like Sergio Leone would have rhapsodized over. But Gary Green isn't just a crazy looking prop, he's also a great actor, and he does crazy things with a part that shouldn't work but they just do, as he reacts to things in ways that it's possible no other human being has ever done before, which is great when you're playing an alien stuck in a stoner's body. I mean, the dude really just knocks it out of the park. Nothing but praise for every aspect of his performance, all the more impressive considering Gary Green's only ever played bit parts up until now. It's highly unlikely that you'll ever forget the guy after having seen him, because it's that rarest of things, a genuine star-making turn. Although that said, I'm not entirely sure that he'd work in any possible context. I mean, he's not the kind of guy you'd want just playing a normal person. Perhaps, however weird it is to say, he was just born to play this role, which in a sense I suppose you could say he was. The movie Fried Barry is a kind of spin-off from a short that Ryan Kruger had made a few years earlier, essentially a very experimental, visceral kind of 3-minute mood piece about a guy taking drugs. Again, Barry, played by Gary Green. It's a pretty solid display of style, but there's zero substance to it, and it doesn't reveal any of what makes the finished feature so great. But at least in as much as Ryan Kruger conceived of Fried Barry the movie with Gary Green in mind, then there's a case that he was writing specifically to suit his lead actor. But by and large, the great things about Fried Barry are things that are hard to describe, or rather that lose a lot of their magic in the telling. There's weird shots, erratic flourishes, moments of lunacy, depravity, downright weirdness that you'd have to see to really believe. What's important to understand though is that Fried Barry isn't just one of those awful trying to be a cult movie films. It's actually approaching something like being a genuine cult-worthy viewing experience. The problems with trying to achieve cult status are manifold, and no doubt you'll have your own opinion opinions on the matter. First off, almost no genuine cult movies ever set out to be cult movies. A cult movie is a movie that attracts an irrationally over-devoted audience to it, usually of a far larger size than anticipated. To me, the things that work the most about real cult movies is that they're made with a genuine desire to do something great, the obvious example being Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space, but also include more critically successful stuff like David Lynch's Eraserhead. The key to me is that we're seeing a work produced by a singular mind that feels genuine and unmediated, like we're engaging in a kind of mind meld with the creators as they pour their ideas directly into our brains. And that's what Fried Barry feels like, a raw stream of unadulterated craziness beamed straight to our subconscious mind, not something that's just trying to be weird for the sake of it. I mean, I was terrified that this was going to end up being something like Psycho Goreman that came out earlier this year, which to me is the perfect example of a movie designed from the ground up as a cult film, complete with layer after layer of suffocating irony and postmodern winking at the audience, where everything's a joke and nothing feels genuine. To me, that's because irony and postmodernism are distancing mechanisms brought about by the fear of exposing your own creativity to others, leaving you with the need to turn everything into a sneery joke for fear that people will laugh at you for taking genre stuff seriously. There's way too many films about that think that putting fake rain on your movie and shoving in random retro nostalgia in-jokes mean you're making something clever and self-aware. Well, you're not. You're just wasting your time and mine. I mean, there are one or two moments in Fried Barry that do veer dangerously towards the postmodern, such as the opening censor's warning, and then there's an intermission in the middle that feels kind of out of place, because it takes us out of the movie, which is really, really immersive and involving, and dare I say it, almost mind-altering in places. It's weird, because otherwise I really feel like Fried Barry plays things very straight for a movie about an alien in a drug addict's body. It never feels the need to put in that mocking distance, and instead gets up close and personal whenever it can, and the crazy thing is that it earns itself the right to get quite emotional in places, in spite of the weirdness, and I'd be lying if I said that there isn't a real pathos to the ending. It's not just a stupid throw weird shit at the screen and see what sticks movie, it's got heart, and not in that awful fake American way, but in a way that feels genuine. If I do have any criticisms of Fried Barry, they're to do with the fact that a movie this really, really unique and really weird, that feels like it's ripped straight from a mind with immense reserves of artistic energy, by its very nature, is kind of hit and miss. Individualism is great, it's a great thing to have as a director, but there's a reason that populist movies sell, because they're pitching themselves at the collective audience. Ryan Coogler can really surprise you with the stuff in his head, which is great, but it's also so bizarre that inevitably not everything he's impressed with will also impress you. It means that some sequences don't quite land, although most of the seemingly random episodes slot into an overall sequence of cause and effect. There's a moment just after the halfway point when it looks terrifyingly like everything's going to start making sense. Barry's captured and tortured, then the next thing we know his torturer tells him why he's doing so. Thankfully the tyranny of conventional plotting is soon abandoned, but that whole segment feels a little clunky, especially as it punctures our image of Barry as a weird kind of Christ-like figure when he takes way too much pleasure in exacting his bloody revenge on his captor. And speaking of Christ, there is actually quite a lot of Christ-like metaphors thrown in for good measure. For example, alien Barry can heal people just by touching them, but you probably will miss them underneath all the sleaze, sex and savagery. There's definitely things in Fried Barry you're unlikely to forget in a hurry, including a gruesome childbirth sequence, but I think that the things that are the most rewarding are the small moments of connective tissue between the key plot points, where alien Barry is just reacting to things, or moving in a way that feels genuinely alien, or expressions or strange shots, coupled with a particularly hallucinogenic bit of soundtrack music. It's not a film that doesn't have a journey to take us on, but it's at its most enjoyable when it's not trying to make sense, but just letting us step into Barry's shoes. Weirdly, the more I think about Fried Barry, the more I realise I liked it, which is weird because I was all ready to be hit by shallow, crude, fake cult movie bullshit, and instead got served up something very strange indeed. When it's firing on all cylinders, there's parts of Fried Barry that I really, really love, even if it's patchy, and I think it's worth putting up with the bits that don't work for me, if it means that I can get at least 3/4 of a film that really amazes me. Which means, of course, that Fried Barry is clocking in at an almighty 4 stars out of 5 for me, because I love the fact that even in its long years, it doesn't lose sight of where it's all going, and if you decide to watch it again, you'll be surprised at just how few of those random weird things that happened don't have some kind of impact on Barry's journey. It's great that Fried Barry's on Shudder, because it means that more people are going to hopefully get a chance to see it, even though chances are it's not going to be a film for everybody. You just have to appreciate what a genuine love of the strange and the askew Ryan Kruger has got, as opposed to some smirking, sensationalistic postmodern twat who thinks he can just chuck any old shit at the camera and make us laugh at how weird and cool it all is. So yeah, Fried Barry, quite literally the best South African film I've ever seen. Isn't that a nice quote?
Why don't you start being honest with me and tell me what the fuck is going on around here?
Well, Sharon, all I can say is I really hope that next time you are a little more cooperative.
Please, I just want to go home.
But you're not ready to go home, Sharon.
I'm perfectly healthy.
Oh, you might think you are, but you are not.
You or whoever's behind this is gonna pay through the nose. Do you hear me? Mark my words.
Your words are marked. Now, you must come with me. We have to check your vitals. Very important. Please.
So let's turn our attention now to a movie that goes by the name of Antidote, released on the 11th of May, courtesy of Uncorked Entertainment. Now, Antidote falls into that broad subgenre of the medical horror film. Now, medical horror films can be great. They can really get under your skin because the subgenre itself is based upon a shared fear of the vulnerability of our own bodies. Nearly all medical horror movies carry with them some metaphorical point about our current state, from the likes of Coma and the Clonus horror in the 70s, right up to movies like A Cure for Wellness and Brandon Cronenberg's Antiviral in the present day. But unfortunately, Antidote isn't a great medical horror film. The setup is pretty basic. Sharon, who's played by Ashlyn Yenny, wakes up with appendicitis and is rushed to hospital, but wakes up in a strange and sinister faculty, where a group of oddball patients are under the sway of a cacklingly omniscient doctor, who's played by Louis Mandylor, who is the brother of Costas Mandylor, who you'll be familiar with from the Saw franchise. And the gimmick here is that the patients are all being routinely butchered and tortured and are then brought back to life by being given a brand new miracle cure-all. Of course, Sharon tries to escape, and we are gradually clued into what's going on here thanks to a slew of gratuitous flashback scenes. So there's a few things wrong with Antidote, which is brought to us by the guy that directed 1993's Sex and the Single Alien, and weirdly, its 2015 remake as well. But none of them are significant enough that they overshadow the fact that it just feels so unbelievably dull. So the whole movie takes place in a series of grey corridors and nondescript prison cell type rooms, and even the sparse moments of gore aren't enough to lighten things up visually. Even in the moments that call for some artistic flourishes, like the hideously rendered CGI finale, makes you wish that the director hadn't bothered, because it's awful in a completely different way. It's a really, really ugly film to look at, and that makes it superficially quite hard to warm to. Second of all is Ashlyn Yenny herself, who seems to have made a career out of getting parts because other people have dropped out at the last minute. That's not a slight against her, but reading an interview with her about the movie, it sounds like even she seems a little amazed to have landed the starring role. So it was originally offered to a quote-unquote name TV actress, apparently, and somehow I can't help but think that Ms. Name TV actress probably isn't now watching Antidote and thinking, fuck, I wish I hadn't turned down this role. I mean, I think Ashlyn Yenny's fine. If you're not sure who Ashlyn Yenny is, she made her big break in The Human Centipede Parts 1 and 2, and seems to be working on carving out a niche for herself as a low-tier scream queen at the moment, but I just don't think she has quite the presence and charisma necessary to actually carry the movie. Although that said, I think probably even the great Carolyn Williams couldn't do much with this particular role. Which takes us to the biggest issue with Antidote, which is it does kind of suck. Not in the worst way possible, but the problem is, the main idea, people being used as guinea pigs hacked up and stitched back together by cold, immoral surgeons to whom they're self-perpetuating lab rats, wonderful. What do they do with that idea? Well, they use it as a backdrop for bland soap opera flashbacks before building to a big revelation. And it's one of those big revelations that, yeah, pretty much ruins the whole point of the movie, and instead substitutes bland, cliched pap. It's pretty much the most simplistic, unoriginal twist you could possibly hope for, and it completely invalidates all the cool social commentary of the premise up until this point, and it expects us to be impressed with how clever it's being too. It is hard to talk about why the ending sucks so much without spoiling the whole film, and that is pretty frustrating. But what is also frustrating is that however bland and half-assed a lot of the first half of the movie feels, is that the ideas it plays with are really interesting, and make you wish they were being handled by somebody with something more worthwhile to say. It's like a movie afraid to make a point about the immorality of medical science, and if that's the case, then why fucking bother? On that point, the last fucking line of this movie kills me because it's so hideously, unironically trite. It's enough to actually make me want to spoil this whole film for you, but out of deference to some of Antidote's better qualities, and it does have some, I'm not going to do that, but do not expect anything but disappointments. Just one thing more that's come to mind now. In the interview I read with Ashlyn Yenny, she mentions being cast at short notice and the shoot being quick, both of which make sense. What is kind of weird is that she's also listed as a co-producer in the opening credits, which makes me wonder just what sort of involvement she actually had here and what kind of deal she managed to cut for herself. I mean, whatever the case, I think that, as I've said, there's just enough good ideas in Antidote to keep your brain ticking over. But sadly, they're not just underused, but they're fucked up quite badly, leaving me wishing that they'd had the courage of their convictions. There's no real characters and the gore feels perfunctory, with most of the nastiest stuff happening off screen. I'd still give it probably 2 stars out of 5 overall, because it is serviceable enough in that cold, efficient way of most medical thrillers, even if it does shit the bed by the very end.
You think this place will close down?
Nah, we've got insurance, and the sign out front clearly says, skate at your own risk. We do all the right things, and it didn't close down when the kid died.
What kid? What happened?
Well, some fat lady who should have been skating fell and broke her finger. She's suing.
I was obviously talking about the kid that died. What happened?
Yeah, a kid died here back in the 80s.
What happened?
Well, he was epileptic, and he had a seizure because of the strobe lights. He collapsed on the floor, and then got ran over by the speed skate session.
Ouch. Parents didn't know about strobe lights and seizures?
It was the babysitter that brought him. She didn't know any better. She learned the hard way.
Let's move next on to something that I was fairly excited about, which is an 80s throwback movie that goes by the name of Death Rink, released on the 11th of May. Now, there's loads of 80s kids who have now grown up and are making movies that pay tribute to the sort of stuff that they grew up on, and nowhere is this more true than in the realm of the 21st century slasher movie. Death Rink looks all set to pay homage to the 80s with its combination of stalk and slash carnage and roller skating, but to be honest, it's a pretty tepid effort that will probably be largely forgotten by the time the end credits appear. We're introduced to a gang of 5 employees at the Roller King skate rink, a bunch of affable but petty misanthropes who we're going to be stuck with for the rest of the runtime. And Death Rink only runs at a tight 75 minutes. There's a pair of Beavis and Butthead inspired slacker dudes, French and Daly, an older authority figure in the shape of Rachel, played by Catherine McCune, and 2 girls, Cara and Wendy, and they're all pulling an after-hours shift at the rink, purportedly cleaning up after they've shut, but actually just spending the time holding an impromptu party, complete with booze, pizza and plenty of sex chat. In fact, it's quite hard to accept that they're even employees given how little time they actually spend working, but they are sure as hell horny. So over the course of the night, they're plagued by a Black Christmas-style crank caller, who identifies himself as Satan, as our little band gets tangled up in a complex, interweaving web of who wants to sleep with who and who's already done so. The acting is pretty basic and some of the characters' interactions feel a little stilted, but these are pleasant enough people to hang out with, even if they are incredibly crude. Problem is, though, that this is a slasher movie. Most throwback modern-day slashers tend to focus on the gore and the carnage, which is always the most memorable element of the genre. Uncensored indie directors try to outdo the mayhem of the 80s, but Death Rink definitely skimps on the kills and ends up feeling more like one of those very tame 90s floating heads slasher movies of the post-Scream variety, except without mid-tier teen heartthrobs and the obligatory hip-hop performer. And the script is kind of trying to do a kind of Kevin Smith-like kind of thing. More than half of this movie is just our characters sitting around shooting the shit, which wouldn't be a problem if the kills were better. However, I would be lying if I said that I was impatiently waiting for the bodies to start piling up, because I think our group here is just entertaining enough to hold our attention. One of the issues with the killed off one by one trope is that you need to split your group up and start chipping away at the most disposable members of the cast. And with a film that's got such a small number of characters as Death Rink, the minute people start vanishing, the others are going to know something's up, and then the trapped in a single location angle goes out the window. There's also a certain amount of fun to be had just spending your time in a closed down skating rink just because it's a cool location, and you get to share in the character's delight at getting to play about here. Director Daniel Zubayati seems to be making a career out of slashers set in fun locations, with 2010's Hackman, killer in a gaming arcade, 2007's Dead Drunk, which is a killer in a bar, 2020's Last Call, killer in a tavern, and 2021's Midnight Screening, killer in a cinema. And speaking of Daniel Zubayati, it's interesting to note that this is a movie that was originally written way back in 2007. A lengthy gestation period for a low-budget horror is nothing new, but what's weird is that this movie is actually set not in the 80s as you might think, but in 2001, which makes me wonder if it had been made in 2007, would it still have been set in 2001, and if so, why? Setting a film 6 years ago doesn't really constitute a period piece per se, whereas watching Death Rink now, the action is 20 years ago, which does make it a full-blown historical movie. If we're splitting hairs, and I mean I'm not really that bothered, but there are a few inconsistencies that do spring out. If this is set in 2001, why is there a packet of crisps in the vending machine that gets a close-up with a 2018 sell-by date on it? Why is there a reference to an Xbox when the Xbox wasn't made commercially available until 6 months after the events in this movie took place? And, strangest of all, we get to see a poster for a movie that goes by the name of Los Gringos prominently on a wall several times, and this is actually an in-joke because the director of Los Gringos was, of course, Daniel Zubayati, so he's shouting out his own movie. But the problem is that Los Gringos didn't come out until 2006. I mean, the set decorators plopped a Blockbusters card and a floppy disk on the table for all to see, but didn't pick up on that. But there are few films that really suck just because somebody mucked up a small piece of set decoration. A shonky timeline doesn't puncture the general air of daft slackers goofing about, although as a slasher film, I do think Death Rink does leave a lot to be desired. It's got fairly pedestrian kills and the obligatory twist ending that doesn't suck as much as you might think it would, even if it's pretty obvious which piece of the Rink's history will give birth to this particular killer, as the eldest of the group, Rachel, regales her younger co-workers with a neat Rinkside twist on the usual kind of campfire urban legend storytelling trope. When we do see the killer, he dresses entirely in stuff from the Lost and Found, including one of those shiny plastic Roswell alien type face masks, which is definitely not the coolest look for a killer in the world, but definitely light years ahead of the likes of Ryan Nicholson's bowling bag killer from the thematically similar Gutter Balls. Although that said, don't expect anything like Gutter Balls. This is more like a very tame TV movie version of one of those whodunit style slashers like Prom Night, but there are definitely worse ways to spend your time. So Death Rink is far from a great movie, but it is perfectly serviceable, if forgettable. It's a 2.5 stars from me, because I think the cast are all likeable enough, and at 75 minutes I didn't feel too annoyed that things move so slowly. Even the most authentically 80s slasherish thing about it is the fact that it's got a really cool poster that's way better than the movie itself.
That crew killed 4 people last week, and we got them. And we could have got more of them if my cover wasn't blown.
Fuck your car, Zeke! You were off on your own, as usual. No backup, nothing.
No backup, because there's nobody on the force I can fucking trust!
From now on, you're gonna learn to be a team player. You're getting a partner. Genie, send Shanky.
Do I look like a fucking Jamaican nanny? I'm not babysitting some fucking rook.
Yes, you are. Just because your dad was chief fucking Marcus Banks doesn't mean you get out of this shit.
Stop making this about my father, okay? He's gone. You're the head of the department now.
It's been 12 years.
Yes, 12 fucking years. 12 years ago, I turn in a dirty cop. I get a medal for it. Big fucking deal. I also got a bullet, and I got to look over my back for the rest of my career.
Shut up! It's too fucking hot in here for me to listen to this bullshit. I got a heat wave going on. We got rolling blackouts. The city is nuts. Stop!
You want to see me, Captain?
Yeah, come in. Zeke, I want you to meet Detective in Training, William Shank. He was the top of his academy, so don't screw this up. Zeke is gonna break you in, show you the ropes.
Detective Banks, let's get to it. Yep.
Go.
Yep.
Officer Harris, 103, Officer Harris, 103.
Let's move on now to our first huge theatrical release of the year, it is of course released on the 14th of May to cinemas, Spiral from the Book of Saw, aka the 9th film in the Saw franchise. Before things start, let's just get this out of the way. Spiral from the Book of Saw has to be one of the worst names for a film ever conceived of. I mean, never mind the fact that we had a movie called simply Spiral, released just last year, ruling out the fact that this could simply have just called itself Spiral. But that whole From the Book of Saw thing is just one of those insane A Star Wars story type things that sets out to remind casual audiences that this is a movie set in the Saw universe because they don't trust them to be able to figure that out for themselves. Jigsaw was a clever title for the obvious reason it was named after the lead character, as well as featuring the word Saw in the title. Although let's not forget that Jigsaw, the 8th movie in the franchise, was initially going to be called just Saw Legacy. Now instead, we've got the 9th movie in the franchise, which sort of isn't the official 9th Saw movie, but instead a spin-off. This all sounds complicated, it's really not. So nearly 5 years after Jigsaw, which was generally considered disappointing, although I think it's better than Saw the Final Chapter to be honest, we get a brand new entry into the Saw series, which is Spiral from the Book of Saw. What we get here is a police detective by the name of Zeke Banks, played by Chris Rock, who gets drawn into an investigation involving a Jigsaw copycat killer who's targeting corrupt police in the city. With a troubled history, Zeke is paired up with a new partner, Shank, played by Max Minghella, as people in the department start turning up dead. Along the way, he'll get help from his father, who is a famed police legend by the name of Marcus Banks, played by none other than Samuel L. Jackson. But apart from that, it's basically a Saw film. Traps, clues, investigations, flashbacks, running around, and then this huge twist at the end that plays out to a new version of Charlie Clouser's orgasmic Hello Zep theme. So obviously, when you're dealing with a big franchise like this, you'll be coming into it with a lot of your own personal baggage. Everyone's got their own take on established IPs like this, and I'd be lying if I said that if you're somebody that's never seen a Saw movie or doesn't like the franchise overall, there's anything to say that you'll like Spiral from the Book of Saw, because despite its efforts to kind of say, okay, this is a new thing that's sort of connected to the old, which to me is the ultimate marketing case of having your cake and eating it, this is basically just another Saw movie. But for those with any investment in the franchise, there's some interesting things along the way. First off, let's just set some basic groundwork. Now, the Saw franchise is without doubt the most successful horror franchise of the 21st century, in terms of both box office numbers and cultural cachet. For a franchise that's just over 15 years old, I think that you could use the phrase like a Saw movie to anybody and they'd understand exactly what you meant by that. However, I think that in saying that, there's also a lot of misunderstanding surrounding exactly what the Saw franchise is, but we'll get back to that later on. For now though, let's say this: the fact that Saw is the ultimate horror franchise of the 21st century, which really I'm sure nobody can disagree with, is something that I don't like. It shows you how literal audiences have become, that they want their horrors up close and as nasty as possible, without any of the horror movie atmosphere or stylings, and that people are just happy watching actors being ground up and spat out in a range of gruesome and bloody fashions. The fact that the Saw series has become mass entertainment kind of troubles me, not in a puritanical way, but just because I think it shows a lack of imagination in the 21st century viewer, that they're happy stripping away all the trappings of what makes a great horror film and leaving behind nothing but the immediacy of being stuck in a horrible trap. Compared with any other franchise, even something as shamelessly populist as Friday the 13th, which was in a way the Saw of its day, Saw's iconography and style is bleak and minimal, in the same way that comparing a Daniel Craig James Bond movie to Goldfinger makes you a little bit depressed at how bleak and grimy everything looks now, how there's none of the colour or flair in populist entertainment of the 21st century that you could be guaranteed from about the 1950s right through to, say, the early 90s. As a piece of culture, the Saw franchise kinda disturbs me because they're so insanely popular. Although that said, as films themselves, I love the Saw movies and the franchise as a whole. In fact, not only is it probably the most narratively consistent horror franchise of all, it's also probably got one of the highest success rates, in that most of the films are pretty decent, and I don't think there's any of them I don't enjoy on some level. Admittedly, the format is pretty basic and they do tend to stick to that format for each installment, but that doesn't mean that it's a format that doesn't work. Most of the hate in the franchise seems to be directed at parts 7 and 8, Final Chapter or Saw 3D, and Jigsaw. and a lot of that is to do with the fact that they stretch credibility too far in what they asked audiences to believe the Saw characters were capable of doing. To me, I think that Saw 7's twist is the only one that goes too far, although it didn't really bother me until afterwards and I stopped and thought about it. I think if you sat down and plotted out the whole Saw timeline, it would probably crumble under the weight of how many flashback revelations there are, all of which are adding hidden co-conspirators to Jigsaw's machinations. But if you watch them as they're meant to be watched, as adrenaline-fueled thrill rides, then you'll probably end up enjoying pretty much all the series. My personal favourite is Part 3, which, like both Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th before it, is the punched-up, full-blooded movie that embodies the popular idea of their respective franchises more than their respective Part 1s did. Friday and Nightmare 3 also happen to be my favourites of those franchises, now that I think about it. So Saw is also a franchise that takes place more or less very much in the real world, in as much as if they made a movie in which Jigsaw returned from the grave as a zombie, then it would burst the logical boundaries of the Saw universe entirely. However, even though we get meticulously portrayed sequences of gore and violence, the Saw franchise takes part in a real world in which we suspend our disbelief enough to accept that human beings are capable of supernatural feats of ingenuity when it comes to constructing elaborate series of complex and ironic death traps. I've always looked at the Saw films as movies about a supervillain without a hero to fight, where everything's got this comic book pulpy vibe to it, where I'm happy going along with the far-fetched and the impossible aspects of what's required in these films because the drama is so fast-paced and compelling that it doesn't bother me. I mean, Jigsaw is basically a really dark Batman villain. He's got a lair, he's got a costume, he's got a unique modus operandi. Even if the traps themselves stretch credulity, the rules of what the human body can stand up to are pretty much within the realms of possibility, and when people get bloodied and mauled, you accept it. The fact of the matter is, any Saw movie manages to hold your attention, not because you're just here to watch people being dismembered, because I think the franchise got a lot more to offer than that. Less than out-and-out horror film, Saw is a thriller franchise, but unlike most police procedurals or crime movies with which it shares a lot of its approach, it's got the courage of its convictions to show you that we're in a world where people can die and can do so very horribly. Death traps have been a staple of cinema since the silent era, but Saw plays with comic book style perils. We've had the Star Wars style closing walls, we've had the pit and the pendulum and so on, but it manages to invest those things with a new sense of tension because you genuinely never know when someone is going to fall victim to a particular trap. Saw is a series that kills off lead and sympathetic characters regularly, and I never feel that sense of complacency you get where you know that someone's not going to die because they're the hero or because they're important to the plot. In a Saw, anyone can die, which makes the trap sequences so compelling. And on top of that, there's always a sense of drama within the traps themselves, and they're all designed with this kind of gruesome sense of EC comic style irony to them, each in a way that reflects the personality of the person undergoing them, a unique moral dilemma that's been tailored to that specific person. They're not just random gory scenes, each one is a carefully designed set piece that, unlike the standard slasher stalk and slash scenes, has got this whole internal drama to it. We've got the setup, we've got the moral dilemma, which is usually self-mutilation or a much more horrific death, and we've got the ticking clocks. Saw films take the idea of the set piece and stripped away all the bullshit, and at least 75% of the time, I'd say, the trap scenes work because they're horrifically tense, not because we just want to see nasty people going splat. There's always that question of will they actually succeed or not, because we know we're in the hands of filmmakers who are not afraid to show us what will happen if they don't, but also canny enough to know that sometimes it's clever not to do what we're expecting, and that's when they let somebody survive. Not every Saw trap ends in death, but there's always that potential, and the ratio of survivors to victims means that the drama works more often than not. There's always that sense of messy unpredictability, which I think makes Saw so much fun to watch. It wasn't all about wincing at the gore. You might have come for the taboo violence, but you stayed because the story was so damn compelling, with all its philosophizing and its range of brutal, kinetic moral dilemmas, which were all played out against the clock. In a lot of ways, not only do I think that the Saw films are some of the best horror of the 21st century, but they're also one of the best film series of the century, full stop. and they're not torture porn. What they are, though, is incredibly convoluted, and it's here that I'm going to stop rambling and actually start swinging things back to the point at hand. The Saw series was actually incredibly influential in this fastidious approach to continuity that it had. The storyline of John Kramer became this rich, complex tapestry of interweaving characters that built up, each episode bringing fresh details about the history of the characters, whilst also moving things forward. The Saw films were way ahead of Marvel in making films where every small detail mattered, and where anybody could turn out to be a vital part in the story several movies after their first appearance. Saw was the first horror franchise that was self-aware about its status as a multi-film franchise, and it used that knowledge of the form to tell a dense, layered story. This was one of the elements of the Saw films that was both a strength and a weakness. When a new film came out every year, then it was essentially like a very slow TV series of annual feature-length specials. Because the franchise was so culturally important, you could always be guaranteed that you'd be able to pick up the previous installments on DVD before you went to the cinema to see the latest one. For example, if Saw 5 was playing, then you knew you'd need to see Saws 1 to 4 first. Parts 1 to 6 were all numbered to help convey the idea that this wasn't the sort of franchise you could just dip in and out of, which flew against a lot of the wisdom of the era, which was that numerically titled franchise installments were alienating to audiences. For this, you need to look at things like Pirates of the Caribbean or the Transformers films. Saw embraced its identity as a multi-part epic and wore its numbers as badges of honour, and layered on the continuity like a nobody's business. For a while, you were actually encouraged to buy into the whole thing, and the DVDs were some of the best-selling titles of the decade, as people did just that. Saw always asked you to buy into its mythology, whilst also rewarding the people that did with more tightly interwoven plot threads with each new installment, which would in turn hopefully lead to more interest for the next film. But in the end, the franchise decided to call it a day with Saw 3D The Final Chapter, which was the 7th film. Part of the problem was that it layered on one twist too many, and after piling on so many of these revelations about John Kramer's life and legacy, Saw 3D's twist just finally went too far, and clearly the writers felt this too, that they'd exhausted all the possibilities, and now, in the words of Graham Chapman's Monty Python Brigadier, it was all getting too silly. So the final chapter came and the Saw movies bowed out, but 7 years later, Jigsaw, which was a semi-prequel, came along and did okay for itself, but it wasn't the full-blown new start for the franchise. Part of the problem was that so much time had gone by that it was hard for viewers that weren't up to speed on the franchise. Jigsaw still tied into a lot of continuity from the other 7 parts of the saga and wasn't accessible to new viewers, whereas the die-hard fans seemed to be the most harsh of the film's critics. I actually think Jigsaw's pretty decent, and it's actually, I'd say, a better reintroduction of the franchise than Spiral is. Therefore, it was probably inevitable that the only way to proceed was to start all over again. The trend was bucked, and along came Spiral from the Book of Saw, the first Saw film with no continuity with any previous installments. So we've got to Spiral at last. So I think what we need to understand here is that Spiral is a serious attempt to reawaken the whole Saw brand for a new generation of viewers, not this cute legacy film like Jigsaw was. Clearly, the intention is to try and attract the kind of audiences that the franchise used to get back in the late 2000s. So gone are all the complex plot threads that require your audience to understand the franchise's ongoing narrative, and instead what we've got is the second ever Saw film after part 1 that's designed to play to an audience of non-Saw fans. To illustrate this, let's have a look at the cast. We've got both Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson, huge stars, but not huge horror stars. They're the kind of stars that can open films on their names alone. Even though Chris Rock was personally involved in developing Spiral from the Book of Saw, both names seem like examples of big name stunt casting in an attempt to grab in that populist mass audience. Neither of them are names that you'd ever think to see in the credits of a Saw movie, are they? I admit I'm not really that familiar with Chris Rock's body of work because I'm just not that interested in American comedians, but he is, I'd say, a strong lead in this, and for once we've got a very clear heroic protagonist instead of focusing on villains putting a group of victims through their games. There's also a rather less obvious revision of the style of Spiral versus versus the Saw films in general in what it chooses to spend its time on. This isn't something that's necessarily as easily as explained, but Spiral seems somewhat less interested in the drama of its traps and becomes more about Detective Zeke, Chris Rock's character, involved in this whodunit investigation. Who's the Jigsaw copycat he's hunting down? The pace is probably slower than your average Saw film, and there are scenes that expect us to care for the characters and buy into their world, rather than the kind of hyper-kinetic comic panel characterization that you get with the characters in the Saw sequels. There's this whole buddy cop vibe to the investigation that, coupled with the lack of time devoted to playing out the various traps, makes Spiral feel like it's tackling the Saw mythology from a very different angle. And then there's the whole question of, is Chris Rock overdoing the comedy? There's absolutely zero doubt in my mind that Spiral's got more comedy in it than any other Saw movie, but it's not out and out slapstick, obviously. It's more of these kind of subtle, kind of sarcastic monologues from Rock's character, largely during the opening acts. For me, I don't think the series has ever really needed more comedy in it. That's never something I've ever felt that I needed, but I think that the films work well in part because they're so focused on the drama and don't feel the need to include comedic moments to break up the tension. I think that the comedy in Spiral isn't great and actually sets the movie back a bit. I'd certainly have lost about 10 minutes of Chris Rock doing his droll character comedy and focus instead more on punching up some of the traps, just because I think those comedy moments feel so out of place, no matter how deliberately different a film Spiral is to its predecessors. But when we go from a scene of a dude ripping out his own tongue to Chris Rock doing a wacky Tarantino type monologue about Forrest Gump, it just feels jarring. I read a review actually that said that the idea of Chris Rock in a Saw film seemed like a great idea. And I mean, it doesn't. Not at all. I mean, it seems like a terrible idea. The good thing is that it does work out in the end, but I'd have been happier had Chris Rock totally flown in the face of expectations and played the part 100% seriously, instead of still clinging to these few moments of comedy that should have been jettisoned entirely. It's not like it's a movie that starts off lightly and then gets more serious. Things are grisly to start with, and Zeke's character's history is such that he shouldn't be this flippant, wisecracking asshole when we first meet him. But I think that the overall emphasis on more fleshed out characters, flashes of comedy and downplayed traps all mark Spiral out as the kind of Saw film that's designed to try and appeal to an audience of casuals. So then there's the traps. I think Spiral probably has less time devoted to its traps than any other Saw film does, and they don't seem designed with quite the same eye for the dramatic as a lot of the classics from the series have. One trap even cuts away, it sets it up, then it cuts away, then it leaves its outcome to be relayed to us in flashbacks later on. I don't want to use the word perfunctory to describe the traps, but there's a certain sense that because everything else has been shifted around in the formula, that the trap set pieces feel a little bit off, like the filmmakers can't quite decide whether they want to change the rulebook or not. There's something significant and unique about the traps in Spiral, but I don't particularly want to spoil it, but there is a common thread to every trap scene. See if you can spot what it is. Speaking of filmmakers, now would be a good time to mention that Spiral from the Book of Saw is, I think, the fourth Saw film to be directed by Darren Lynn Bousman. Bousman came to prominence directing the first three Saw sequels and is one of the MVPs of the franchise, given his claim to having ushered in some of the most successful films in the series. Personally, I think his unpretentious, some ways old-fashioned style really works well for the franchise. I think he's done some really good work outside the Saw films as well. He did that nunsploitation movie Saint Agatha, which I think is a particular highlight, as well as a great segment in Tales of Halloween. And I also really liked a film he did last year that went by the name of Death of Me, which didn't get great reviews, but to me was the kind of sturdy, low-budget genre standard that we don't get enough of. I think Darren Lynn Bousman's got a really nice grounded approach to his work. He never seems to be somebody that gets bogged down in just flair for the sake of it or pretentious stuff. He's less of a Dario Argento or a Lucio Fulci and more of a kind of Umberto Lenzi, a grafter who makes good solid entertainment, what you might refer to as a safe pair of hands. In actual fact, Darren Bousman is one of my favourite horror directors of modern times, believe it or not, and I'll happily watch anything that he does. It's pretty cool that he's come back to the franchise that made him so famous, and this time he's dealing with the franchise's biggest budget to date. Though he sticks to the familiar visuals of the franchise, all, rusty metal and twisted wire, he also opens out the world coupled with a visual approach to Chris Rock's scenes that echoes the sort of jittery swagger of his character, coupled with some somewhat ill-advised kind of hip-hop inflected cues that I think play in some of his earlier scenes. Whilst there aren't really any images in Spiral that really stick in the imagination, the whole movie glides along smoothly into new territory. To me, Darren Lynn Bousman is one of the great figures key to the Saw franchise's success. The first two are, of course, James Wan and Leigh Whannell, director and writer of the original classic. If Bousman is number 3 and series icon Tobin Bell is number 4, then the fifth and perhaps most important player is, of course, composer Charlie Clouser. I cannot say enough good things about Charlie Clouser and his work, seriously. Clouser has composed the score for all 9 Saw films to date, and his music is arguably one of the most iconic horror scores of all time. In fact, I don't think I could imagine Saw without Clouser's soundtrack. Along with the beauty of his triumphantly gnarly Hello Zepp theme, Clouser has composed 9 soundtracks full of dark, seething, tense, industrial music. I remember James Wan once described Clouser's music as embodying the quality of rust, and you can almost feel a physical texture to each of his bits of music. They're epic, they're dark, and they're able to convey an entire dramatic narrative by themselves. I think Clouser's Saw soundtracks are hands down some of my favourite horror soundtracks of all time. Again, I think his score for Saw 3 is the best, but each has got a share of really, really great tracks. Clouser understands the franchise inside out, and there are few people that can write such compelling music in the key of rust as Charlie Clouser. Like John Carpenter before him, he's able to add music to a scene that totally makes the finished product just spring to life and really punch it up to the level of something outstanding. The Saw films have always known how to use their music, and Charlie Clouser is a fucking soundtrack legend, and so far he's the only person that's contributed to every single Saw film, and I for one cannot imagine the series without him. Along with Cliff Martinez and Max Richter, Clouser is somebody whose work I will seek out whenever I see he's done something new, whether it's a soundtrack for a film that I've actually seen or not, and I actually think there's a possibility that I might like every single soundtrack that Charlie Clouser has ever composed. So, of course, I was expecting big things from the Spiral soundtrack, the first new Saw-themed score in nearly 5 years, and only the second new Saw score in over 10. And like other aspects of Spiral, the soundtrack is at a slightly different angle, but it is still fundamentally a Saw score. Weirdly, I think it was one of those soundtracks that didn't strike me too much when I was watching the film itself. The thing is, Charlie Clouser isn't big on leitmotifs, which are these easily identifiable musical themes for certain aspects, like, character themes. A lot of his music isn't show-offy, but functional. And after having watched Spiral, I was convinced that this is one of the poorest Saw scores because of that lack of familiarity. Hello Zepp is one of the greatest bits of horror music ever written, and the thing is, it's used really sparingly in Spiral, largely reserved for the last kind of 15 minutes or so. And also, as I said earlier, or as you'll know if you're a Saw fanatic, each Saw film ends with a final twist and a new version of the Hello Zepp theme plays out, and I think, and I stand by this, that Spiral has one of the poorest renditions of Hello Zepp for its closing moments. That just feels a bit basic and not too special. What I was wrong about though was that Spiral is a poor Saw soundtrack, because it's not. Having listened to the album several times through, there's plenty of great cues here, especially the dynamic Wax Angie and the tense B partners. There's a few new sounds on display for this entry into the Saw soundtrack pantheon, but it's actually a lot better than some of the more forgettable of the Saw scores to date, which to me would be parts 4 and 5. Charlie Clouser is still going strong, managing to keep his musical vocabulary alive and vibrant after 9 films. Still, one of the most impressive records for sustained soundtrack work in a single film franchise. But moving on from the soundtrack and on the subject of impressive track records, the one thing that stands out about Spiral is that it's the first Saw film without any real Tobin Bell in it. To me, Tobin Bell is Saw, and his John Kramer Jigsaw character is one of the things that makes the franchise so great. His performance in all 8 previous Saw films is wonderful, and he brings with him a real gravitas and conviction, a perfect voice and an amazing, mesmerising quality that just brought John Kramer to life. Tobin Bell is, for my money, one of the greatest actors in horror history, and his Jigsaw is a rich and complex anti-hero that you just cannot take your eyes off. I mean, I'm going to say something really sacrilegious, which is that I think he gives a better performance than even Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger, and I think that Tobin Bell might be my favourite ever performance from a horror villain. Everything I ever want from my villains is just super intelligent, gracious, dangerous, softly spoken, totally focused, and confident in his beliefs at all time. I just love the character so much, and even in some of the ropier sequels, I can always buy Jigsaw because Tobin Bell is so fucking fantastic in the part. So naturally, the idea of a Saw movie without Tobin Bell in it seemed like a disturbing idea, because to me the sequels were less interesting when they're about other people taking on the Jigsaw mantle, because nobody could ever come close to being as great as John Kramer. And Spiral deals once again with the Jigsaw copycat. This time, instead of the familiar Billy puppet on a tricycle, we've got this just hideous pig puppet in a police uniform. Pigs as in police, but also pigs have been a key visual in the franchise, with a memorable speech about how they're capable of feeling compassion in one of the sequels. To me though, the iconography is less important than the conviction of the person behind it all, and Spiral substitutes a serial killer narrative for whodunit investigation where we don't know which of the cast of characters around Detective Zeke is the Jigsaw copycat. So seemingly to a lot of people, the twist in Spiral was way too obvious, as in it's way too easy to guess who the killer actually is, and I am happy to admit that I didn't predict who it was, but then I don't ever really try and outguess a film. I'm happy just going along for the ride. I think that the reveal is less the issue than it is the fact that not knowing the killer, not getting the chance to spend time with them, changes the whole angle of the movie towards a more conventional, hero-centric storyline. So with that means that we lose the twisted ideological justifications, and instead we substitute that with clues, flashbacks, red herrings, and I think it seems a little less satisfying overall. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I think the end of Spiral works so well, because it's only the last 15 minutes or so that everything starts to really come together and starts to feel like a Saw film for real, when we get the killer talking ideology. Despite all its supposed anti-police angle, Spiral deals a lot more with conventional good and evil than most of the Saw films do, and its moral dilemmas are way more simplistic. The people that get trapped in Spiral are all unsympathetic assholes, not complex failures, and they're not really being asked to make a decision that will change their outlook on life, but just to suffer. And that to me is one of the biggest problems with Spiral, and that is that it kind of reinvents the wheel. Obviously, you can't make the argument that changing the formula is bad just because it's different. I don't object to mixing things up on principle, but I think that the end result is something less interesting than any other Saw film, even though the drama operates on something of a different level. The fascinating conversations about morality and survival that you'd usually get in a Saw film are missing from Spiral, because it's basically a murder mystery, and the murder mystery is a form that requires a certain presumption of guilt from the get-go. The killer in Spiral is no John Kramer, and you find yourself wondering just why is this guy actually copying from the Book of Saw? Why has this person decided to copy Jigsaw's style when he clearly doesn't think the same way or even want to achieve the same things? Is the Saw DNA an important part of Spiral's makeup, or would it work just as well if you cut down the resemblance to a Saw film and let it play out as its own thing? Personally, I would rather that they'd gone with something that felt spiritually like it operated more on the level of a Saw film, rather than the film that just happens to have some similarities of style and structure. More than once, I did find myself thinking, well, there's more to a Saw movie than just whatever. Will it ultimately attract that all-important mass audience? It is difficult to say, just based on the film itself. Personally, I think that hiring big names is less important to a movie's chances of ultimately being successful than a good script is, but equally I know that that isn't exactly the case in reality. I'm sure Chris Rock will help increase this film's reach, but then I wonder how many Chris Rock fans that have never watched a Saw film before would jump at the chance to see those two most unlikely of worlds collide. Let's not forget either that in the intervening years between Saw's success as box office gold, the franchise has taken a beating. Time was Saw was a franchise so popular that not only did it do great at the cinema, but it also had its own crazy popular theme park ride. Since then, however, the shape of horror has changed pretty drastically, and generally the Saw films are thought of by critics, if not fans, as the bad old days before all this great elevated horror that we've got nowadays. Like the 80s franchises and slasher films before it, Saw films seem to have become a byword for how bad things got, and chances are the casual audience isn't probably that keen to go back there again, even though the Saw title is buried away in the mouthful of Spiral from the Book of Saw. The whole Saw film mode is already seen as somehow old-fashioned and throwbacky, despite the fact that there have probably been Saw-influenced films made every year since Saw Part 1 was released. So even though it misses out a lot of what makes a Saw movie what it is, Spiral still manages to deliver the kinetic thrills, even if they are a bit slower off the mark, given that we're in entirely new territory this time around. Things are a bit muddled and uneven, but the truth is that this, at the end of the day is another Saw movie, and for my money, that's a good thing. I think it attempts to downplay what makes the series what it is and to move away from what we're familiar with, don't ultimately end up producing anything that works better than what we've had in the past, which means that you end up wondering if they're in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. For me, the Saw films are a very specific thing that work for their own reasons. There's less interchangeable parts in the franchise than you realise, which is why most of the sequels stick so closely to the same basic template. But Spiral is a movie about feeling out the differences, about plunging into the dark and seeing what's ahead, probing new forms in which a Saw film can take, and seeing what works and what doesn't. Charlie Clouser is still on hand to provide that musical cohesion, tying things into the franchise very much, as well as Darren Lynn Bousman. To me, if you really wanted to do something radically different, you wouldn't have got these two guys back. But the fact that they have shows that they're not stupid, just that they're cautious about taking the franchise in a radically new direction. I know you can't just keep doing the same thing forever and ever, but I'd like to see more of an understanding of the ethos of Saw movies in future installments than in simply copycatting its basic template of traps and cops. Chris Rock is an unexpectedly charismatic leading man, but Saw has always been about its villains at the end of the day. The pieces are all here, and Spiral moves along to somewhere quite satisfying, but for a big Saw fan like me, I don't want to see a more grounded, less operatic Saw. I want more. To me, Jigsaw was a great legacy film because it reintroduced all the Saw stuff to us in a way that felt cool and ultra-dramatic, and felt very, very Saw. Spiral never really feels like it knows whether or not it wants to go full Saw, and in the end feels a little too indecisive. However, it is still a slick, big-budget slice of Sawness, and for me, even a slightly off-key Saw film is worth watching, which is why I'm coming in at 3.5 stars for Spiral from the Book of Saw. It's an entertaining film, and I did enjoy it, even if I do see quite a lot of problems with it. It's probably one of my least favourites in the franchise, just because it feels a little bit more diluted, and because it misses out on a lot of what I want from a Saw film, whilst never really quite feeling like enough of its own thing that I don't mind the lack of those familiar elements. I think the more you think of it as a Saw film, the less you're probably going to like it, but if you just come at it as its own thing, then it's perfectly decent at what it does. It's good at what it's trying to do. It's a good film, it's just not a great Saw film. But what it is the first horror blockbuster of the year for me, and I certainly had a pretty good time with Spiral.
At the start of the final hour of the day, set a candle aflame. Place 3 drops of fresh blood unto the melting wax. Face your reflection, speak these words, and make your wish known. Spirit of fire, let the wheel of fortune turn, grant me my desire. Should your strength of will survive until the stroke of midnight, extinguish the flame and the Djinn will grant your heart's desire. But beware the Djinn's toll, for the gift that you seek may cost your soul. Artifacts required: 1 clock, 1 candle, 1 mirror.
Let's move on to a movie called The Djinn, D-G-I-N-N, as in Genie. Now, The Djinn was released on the 14th of May, American movie, of course, obviously about an evil wish-granting genie. So there's a lot of movies made these days, especially horror movies, that get labelled as 80s throwbacks. In the case of The Djinn, that involves slapping on some synth music and setting it in 1989, but other than that, there's nothing 80s about The Djinn, because 80s movies were never this blandly forgettable. In fact, dealing with, as it does, a deadly wish-granting genie, The Djinn calls to mind one of the more fondly remembered 90s monster movies, which is of course Wishmaster, which was crazy and vibrant and cool, full of extravagant, clever set pieces, cool effects, and a host of genre icons, and was about a killer genie. The Djinn is almost identical, apart from the fact that it features no clever set pieces, no cool effects, and no genre icons. What it does have, though, is a killer genie. Well, sort of, anyway. What we get instead is a movie about a young mute boy who's traumatised by his mother's suicide, finding an ancient book of shadows wherein lies a spell of desire, complete with instructions on how to get your wish to come true. The kid follows the instructions, but doesn't bother turning onto the next page where all the bad small print is, because he's too excited about the chance to get his voice back. Naturally, he casts the spell and bad stuff starts to happen. Cue as much mayhem as you can fit into a very small apartment, as we get essentially a supernatural home invasion. The sad thing is, The Djinn should be way better than it is. It starts off really well and is pretty nicely directed and scored. I mean, it's nothing new, but it's pretty slick and it sets up the pieces pretty nicely as we get ready for the be careful what you wish for stuff to happen. I know it's easy to say, well, it's not as good as Wishmaster over and over again, and that's definitely true. I mean, I think Wishmaster is a great film, but the trick with that movie was that the genie was homicidal but could only kill you by using your own wish against you, which brought with it a degree of twisted ingenuity to each extravagantly gory and imaginative kill. The Djinn is something different entirely, and after the first half hour of setup is over, it quickly moves into being almost entirely a silent film as our young hero can't talk. This would be fine if he was being menaced by a deadly supernatural entity, but there's nothing special about the Djinn that's hunting him down. It's not like Wishmaster where he's this, this single deadly creature. Instead, he takes the form of others to lure the boy out. We don't even get a cool looking villain, just a long chase scene through a dull looking flat, and by about the halfway mark you realise that this is it, this is all we're going to get. And whilst it would be nice to say that it turns into a tense, well orchestrated, contained horror film, it quickly becomes like an extended version of the worst bits of a slasher film. The hiding away from the killer bit without any of the gore or the kills or even any dialogue to break the monotony, and there are no extraneous characters to pump up the body count, just hunter and hunted. Rather than being a case of doing as much as possible with as little in the way of resources, it quickly begins to feel like the filmmakers are trying to give us as little as they can just to string this movie out to 80 minutes. The fact that the ideas are so basic would be fine if there was anything going on to hold your attention. It's one of those movies I'd love to see what the script for it looked like, because there's no dialogue for most of it, just a protracted series of narrowly escaping from the monster sequences where we know that there really isn't anything at stake because they can't kill off the kid halfway through the movie for the simple reason that there's nothing else going on. The Djinn is mind-numbingly tedious, it's sad to say. It's pretty nuts and bolts, but there's nothing in it that's really that bad, apart from how unambitious it is and how flat and repetitive it gets. It would be unfair of me to give it any less than 2 stars, because it's not a terrible movie, just one that runs out of steam after about 5 minutes of our lead character being chased through his house, and then it coasts along for another hour or so after that. If anything, I found my brain wandering to bits from Wishmaster during the particularly tedious parts of slowly creeping around, waiting for something to jump out, and it really got me in the mood for watching that movie again. And somehow, I'm pretty sure that I won't find myself thinking fondly back on the Djinn when I'm watching it, because it's such a bland, by-the-numbers piece of fluff. But like I said, I have seen a lot worse.
Have you had any more memories from before you met Jess?
Oh, I still have just a massive void in my life and that I can't see into.
Well, hypnosis might be something worth considering to unlock some of those memories. How would you feel about that?
Sometimes I just get the feeling that some memories should stay locked away.
There probably was some kind of trauma, Corey, okay? But the mind is complex. You can't count on those memories staying locked away forever. I'm worried about you going to Wales. From what you've said, you're going to be in close proximity to your grandmother's house. Is that something you're emotionally prepared for? You're going to be supervising Sally and her friends. You're responsible for their safety. Just think about that, okay?
Let's move on now to another long-awaited installment in a major horror franchise. None other than The Tooth Fairy 3, The Last Extraction, the concluding part of the Tooth Fairy Trilogy. Never heard of it? Well, neither's anyone else. Now, this is interesting because Tooth Fairy 3 was released via ITN's YouTube channel on the 16th of May, where I watched it before it was pulled the very next day, before its wider release in September. So if you're one of the lucky ones who saw it then you'll know what I'm talking about. I'd be interested to know how popular it was, because I quite honestly have got no idea how popular the Tooth Fairy franchise is. For that, you'd have to ask director-producer Louisa Warren. Now, Louisa Warren is an interesting person. Who's Louisa Warren, you ask? Well, that's a good question. She's a British actress turned director and head of a production company called Champ Dog Films, who's responsible for a spate of ultra-low budget movies that have popped out over the last few years, most of which have been horror films, but she's also shot a few erotic thrillers, which I admit is a genre that I always find myself wondering just how popular they actually are these days, given that their USP is tame sexual content amidst some basic dramatic setup scenes. You'll be familiar with Louisa Warren's work if you've seen such movies as Witches of the Water, aka or The Mermaid's Curse as it was renamed, Cyber Bride, Virtual Deathmatch, or a trilogy of Scarecrow movies, Bride of Scarecrow, Curse of the Scarecrow, and The Scarecrow's Revenge. She's also directed all 3 of the Tooth Fairy movies up to now, and you may or may not be aware also that this is Louisa Warren's 3rd horror movie of the year so far, her first 2 efforts being The Leprechaun's Game and Assistant. And she's already got a sequel to Leprechaun's Game called Leprechaun's Rage, scheduled in pre-production for next year. She's also got multiple projects in the pipeline ready to drop, presumably later this year, including movies called Cannibal Lake, Crooked Man, Legend of the Lizard Man, and Conjuring the Plastic Surgeon. You can see what they're going for there with that particular title. All of which is a roundabout way of saying that Louisa Warren is one busy fucking cat. It's hard to say just how successful her films are, but you've got to give her credit for putting in the work, and clearly it seems that she's decided that mini franchises do better business than one-offs. Hence 3 Scarecrow movies and 3 Tooth Fairy installments. Horror fans have always been pretty fascinated by the idea of franchises and sequels. I don't know what it is, but us horror fans have always loved sequels. Now, I might as well get this out of the way right now. I was thinking of lying, but I'm going to come clean and say that I haven't seen Tooth Fairy 1 or Tooth Fairy 2, which means that perhaps I'm not getting my money's worth here. But I pretty much get the idea that part 1 was about our lead as a kid being terrorised by an evil tooth fairy before he grew up slightly in part 2, and now he's a slightly traumatised adult played here by Andrew Rolfe. Now it might sound pretty cocky of me to say this, but having seen Tooth Fairy The Last Extraction all the way through, I honestly don't feel like I've missed anything much by skipping the first 2 parts. What I can say is that I've seen other movies directed by Louisa Warren before, and therefore I kinda knew what I was getting myself in for. Now, Warren is British, and her movies have a very down-to-earth, no frills, British air to them. But she tends to hire actors who, and I mean this in no way as an insult, seem like they'd be at home in a soap opera. Everyone's very kind of earnest and genuine seeming, and they play out the normal bits with a very kind of realistic approach that makes you forget you're watching a horror film. While I don't think the acting in this is amazing, pretty much everyone does well with what they're given. Nobody overacts, which is a nice change for a micro-budget movie, and Louisa Warren has got a real taste for casting likeable, flawed, ordinary-seeming people that convince you that they're trying their best. Sadly, what she's not so great with is horror and atmosphere, which is a bit of a shame. The Tooth Fairy is represented via a hooded robe and a very stationary, kind of rotting mask. She's always shot in bright lights and without much care and attention, really. It's also never quite clear what her MO is, as she kills people in various sweets and chocolate related ways, but it's never quite clear what she's trying to do and why. For example, there's one guy she starts force feeding chocolates whilst he's blindfolded, then she kind of gets tired of that halfway through and just ends up stabbing him with candy canes. There is of course also a scene featuring Sean C. Phillips, aka Cool Duder, who is of course playing a YouTuber, not too much of a stretch there, who gets to dish out exposition about the Tooth Fairy, which is something that he's done in a lot of Louisa Warren's movies. Cool Duder is a well-known face in super low-budget movies. He's done a huge amount of cameo appearances in all sorts of things over the years, but I always think that when I see him in a movie that things aren't going well. Also, why is he doing his video segment in the movie in front of a row of empty DVD cases? Is that some kind of copyright issue? There is more to like than you'd think in The Tooth Fairy 3, a lot of which comes down to the fact that I feel like I'm getting to know Louisa Warren more and more as a director, and I appreciate her full-bloodedly embracing the genre. There's a lot of crossover between her and the Proportion Productions lot. Proportion Productions are another UK-based low-budget studio run by Scott Jeffrey and Rebecca Matthews, who cornered the market on cheap, no-budget movies and sort of semi-knockoffs of legit studio pictures. They did a movie, Hellcat, that came out this year, which is currently sitting at my second worst movie of the year. I think Louisa Warren's movies feel a lot more genuine and heartfelt than any of the Proportion Productions lot, even if I'm less convinced when they get into the full horror stuff. Sadly, as this is The Last Extraction, aka presumably the last part of the Tooth Fairy Trilogy, there's not much in the way of a satisfying finale to show for all of your investment in the franchise, which is something, of course, I don't have. But if you did, I imagine you'd probably be quite disappointed with this end. The ending is desperately, and I mean desperately, unconvincing, and it's probably the only moment in the whole movie that tips over into being actually quite embarrassing. There's something quite fascinating about Tooth Fairy 3, though. I think it might be something in the way of a spoiler, but you know what? I think I'm going to do the movie more favours mentioning it than omitting it. And that is the fact that it looks as though Warren is keen to blur the lines between the various installments of our horror franchises and suggest that everything that we've seen in our movies over the last few years, scarecrows, leprechauns, tooth fairies, witches of the water, are all linked, and that all these various Champ Dog movies take place in the same, dare I say it, cinematic universe. How do we know this? Simple, because of the Book of Monsters, a rather basic looking notebook with biroed in notes and drawings of the various creatures inscribed within. My only point of comment about this is that whoever did the entry for the Witches of the Water page, based on Warren's film of the same name, must have just bought the DVD and never watched the film, because that page in the Book of Monsters has got a mermaid drawn in it, and having watched Witches of the Water, which was renamed Mermaid's Curse on DVD and had a mermaid slapped on the cover, I can tell you, there's no mermaids in it, but there sure as hell is one on the cover. That's another common theme of Louisa Warren's movies, actually, which is very misleading DVD covers. The image of the Tooth Fairy that we get on all three of the covers for these films isn't at all the same as the version of the Tooth Fairy that we get in the film itself, which I can only imagine was deemed too shoddy to actually sell films based on, which is a little bit tough going, actually. That you're willing to put the effort into lying and putting stuff that's not in the film on the cover because you realise that the stuff in the film just doesn't look that great. Put the effort in at the start and put good stuff in the film that you can use to sell it. But, nonetheless, the idea that under our very noses, Louisa Warren is quietly badgering away at making her own interconnected film saga of mythological monsters is pretty fascinating, because it's not one of those fucking dark universe things where studio execs sit around, see Marvel movies making a shit ton of money, and go, let's do that with our movies. This is something tiny and organic and hard fought, which has been carved away one micro-budgeted piece at a time. Warren's movies mightn't be the most amazing horror movies ever made, but there's a certain charm to them, and I respect her work all the more for seeing how hard she's working at doing her own thing. I'd love to say that The Tooth Fairy: The Last Extraction is a triumph of no-budget cinema, but the reality is it is pretty dull, and when the scares come, they're just a little bit too flat. Before I get to my rating, let me just say this. I will watch anything else that Louisa Warren puts out, and I will certainly be paying more attention to her movies for notes of interconnectivity from now on, and I really do hope she keeps up doing what she does. That said, I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed Tooth Fairy 3. It's a 1.5 star movie for me, one that drifts along amiably before stumbling when it comes to the moments when it needs to shine. I like the cast, I like the overall vibe, but it's just too insubstantial, and it's not got enough flair to keep you around, because knowing how to handle horror and atmosphere isn't something that costs a load of money. It's all about the personal touch, and Louisa Warren is just a little bit ordinary when it comes to shooting horror, but God love her for trying.
Yo, Scott. This is Damon, that's Chambers. They're with me. I'll be on my dime.
Okay.
How's it going?
Working routine, guys.
Scott, you want to tell me what's up with the kid, man? I mean, look at him. No offense, but he doesn't exactly look like zombie killing material, does he?
Hi, my name is Dieter, and I'm going to open what cannot be opened.
Are you kidding me?
No. We need the kid to open the safe. If we lose him, we got nothing. Let's go, guys. Bring it in. Mr. Tanaka, team's all here.
Lovely to have you all gathered here today. Meet your target. The Vegas Bly. You can't fly into Vegas. It's restricted airspace. But you can fly out. There is an abandoned rescue helicopter on top of the North Tower, Sodom. If you coordinate and communicate, this should be a simple in and out.
Now on to another huge, important horror film. Released on the 21st of May to Netflix and also showing in selected theatres, it is Army of the Dead. From the master of style over substance, Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead, which appears to be one of those classic high-concept elevator pitches of Las Vegas heist movie with zombies. So what we've got is a ragtag bunch of macho misfits recruited by a rich Japanese dude who wants to have his fortune retrieved from a Las Vegas vault after the city has been quarantined following a zombie outbreak brought about by a perfectly ordinary series of events involving some dude getting a blowjob whilst driving down the same road as a military convoy carrying a zombie. All the usual types are in place: the guide, the safecracker, the marksman, and so forth, all led by Dave Bautista, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, and is probably the human representation of the phrase "a bear of a man." There they navigate zombie-filled Las Vegas, and zombie hijinks occur. There are a few questions I had going into Army of the Dead, not having watched any of the trailers or knowing any of the plot beyond basics, first of which was, if this is a zombie movie, then why the fuck do they need to steal money from Las Vegas? Answer, because it's not a full-blown zombie apocalypse movie, but a movie where the zombie outbreak has been contained within the walls of a quarantined Las Vegas, which we see courtesy of a Watchmen-style opening credit scene that depicts the outbreak as a series of dramatic tableaus. Okay, next question is, who the fuck would risk going into the middle of a zombie-filled city just for the hope of getting a load of money? And the answer is, lunatics. The group that are assembled to head into Zombie City are a bunch of cocky arseholes, most of whom are willing to risk their lives because they think it'd be fun getting a chance to go crazy and shoot a load of zombies. One of them is even a YouTube star who films himself making headshots for clicks. The rest are a bunch of pretty interchangeable military types who stodge along and make macho quips every now and then. And then there's Dave Bautista's character, who's been saddled with all the quote-unquote character development, courtesy of his teenage daughter with whom he has a load of incredibly forced bonding scenes throughout amidst the carnage, about how he had to personally kill his mother in front of his own child, and how she's now disowned him, and there's all the usual Hollywood bad dad crap we get so much in movies now. It's some of the most unbelievably cynical character drama I've ever seen, sandwiched between long scenes of running and shooting and biting, and I'd adjunct all those father-daughter scenes for a start. Every time father and daughter are in a room together, slow, dreamy piano music starts playing and I feel myself dying a little bit inside. Just get on with it already. Whilst that whole character arc feels so forced it hurts, there's really not much attempt made to flesh out the other people along for the ride. Partly one of the problems here is that I can't identify with the kind of people that would happily do this kind of thing just for money, no matter what artificial motivations the script gives them. Do you want to jump into the middle of a nest of zombies to steal some money? Nah, I'm good thanks. So what we get instead is a team of COD military mercenaries for hire posing about, who don't even have the charisma of the gang of twats from Aliens, who they're probably closest to, and my biggest issue is that I hated the characters in Aliens, so a crappy photocopy of that kind of unit ends up looking weak as fuck. I know that you don't need to like your characters to buy into a movie, but to me, this is like watching a group of idiots strutting into a dangerous wild animal enclosure in a zoo. What happens to them? They get mauled to death, of course they do. They're endangering themselves for no other reason than because they want money, and that's not enough motivation to carry me through a 2.5 hour film. And I can't feel the surge of I hope they make it out alive, or buy into the drama of the situation, because if they weren't such greedy cunts in the first place, none of this movie would need to happen. There's no sense of acting for a greater purpose, and that is pretty wearing. Which brings us on to the next point, which is the zombie movie itself. Now, zombie movies are interesting things. They exist in this strange little niche, slightly outside the horror genre. There are plenty of people who love zombies and zombie movies that would never even think about watching a non-zombie horror movie, which I think is weird. That's because for a lot of people that watch the likes of The Walking Dead or Shaun of the Dead or play zombie games, the thrill is in a set series of apocalyptic tropes. For these people, zombie fanatics, the enjoyment comes from the situation itself, and probably most of these people wouldn't even consider zombies to be a horror thing, but rather more of an action sci-fi hybrid. In a way, I feel that the modern post-Romero zombie has almost become a genre in itself, all about survival and bleak human drama, and of course, headshots. The The problem I have is with these kind of zombie things, the modern day version of the zombie that's flourished in the years since The Walking Dead, although obviously it's got its roots in Dawn of the Dead, and that's the fact that for a lot of zombie fanatics, what they're taking part in is an elaborate wish fulfillment fantasy about arming yourself with loads of guns and running around shooting people without having to feel bad about it. Zombies become designated safe targets in the way that fascist media portrays Middle Eastern people as inhuman targets that it's safe to gun down without compunction. The lure here is living in a post-morality world where you can act out your NRA dreams and be as selfish and nihilistic as you like without having to worry about the consequences of your act. Killing zombies is cool because it's like shooting people, only they're not real people, just lifelike moving targets you can shoot at and blow bloody bits off whilst laughing about it. Forget society crumbling, you've got guns, so that's all that matters, and your standard apocalyptic zombie movie has nothing more to say than, gee, aren't human beings terrible and we're all fucked and nothing matters. In fact, I haven't seen a proper full-on zombie movie that's had anything to say for itself that George Romero hadn't already said by 1985 in a far more eloquent and intelligent fashion. Needless to say, if you've not worked it out already, I don't really like zombie films. I've got plenty of time for 80s Italian zombie movies, which are way more about horror than action, you know, the likes of your Lucio Fulci's Zombie, Hell of the Living Dead, Burial Ground, Nightmare City, all the rest of it. Love them, way more about horror than action, but the militaristic American version that's become the default setting for the genre, I really don't care for at all, so bear that in mind. Now, as I said earlier, Zack Snyder is the ultimate style over substance guy, which means that what we get here is something that 85% shots look like they've been designed to stick into the trailer, images that come about from someone sitting down going, how do I make this look as cool as possible? Now, that's not really a problem in theory, but the things that Zack Snyder thinks are cool, you know, your slow-mo shots of people firing guns, rippling muscles, insane wire work, people striking endless, unironic poses after pose, aren't what I think is cool. That's just a stylistic thing, and it's not exactly my main problem here. What is an issue is the fact that Zack Snyder is also the co-writer of this movie. Obviously, we all know that Snyder was the guy that came to prominence with the James Gunn written remake of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead in 2004. That's all well and good, but what Snyder hasn't picked up on is the idea of the zombie movie as an extended allegory that George Romero pioneered. For me, the Romero movies work because they've got something to say, and though they're not movies I come back to over and over again, I can respect them for what they are. The problem is that in the post-Romero years, all that subtextual weight has been stripped away from the zombie genre, which is why everything feels so fucking militaristic and miserable these days. We all know the form of the zombie genre, which is why people theorise about what would happen in the wake of a zombie apocalypse these days, why that's become a popular thought experiment. And to my mind, there's really not much you can say after it would suck and I'd hold myself up with a load of food and guns and shoot stuff. I really think that zombie movies have to work hard to do anything new, because the genre seems so awfully played out by now. Why is this a problem? Because if, for a moment, we accept that the zombie movie is the great exemplar for the social metaphor within the genre, then the one person that I wouldn't trust to tell a story with any biting criticism or depth whatsoever would be Zack Snyder, the man who operates on the most surface of surface levels. I'm not even convinced that Zack Snyder understands the idea of the zombie as metaphor, much less that he would ever think about making a movie with anything worthwhile to say other than, look how cool all this stuff is. The idea that permeates the George Romero films, that it's the zombies aren't the threat, is actually that humanity is the problem, and that, you know, zombies are just a byproduct of what we become as individuals. The idea that the human beings in, you know, George Romero's zombie films are actually the villains is something that I'm sure Zack Snyder didn't pick up on whatsoever, because it does not translate to anything in Army of the Dead. The good guys are the guys strutting about with guns shooting stuff, and the bad guys are the zombies who just happen to be in their way. So what we get instead is a zombie movie that's designed as a shooter, where the zombies are things to shoot at and the whole thing feels like this big, gaudy computer game full of stuff. Admittedly, some of the stuff is pretty cool to look at. There's a zombie tiger, a zombie riding a full zombie horse, designed by FX legend Gabe Bartalos of course, Leprechaun fame and plenty of other things. I'm sure you're all familiar with his work. There's cool shots of zombies, sort of en masse, sometimes running full pelt, sometimes crowded around their alpha zombie leader in the ruins of deserted Las Vegas. I mean, the setting is all there, the images are all there, but what does it all amount to? It amounts to running around shooting for 2 hours with bits of awful mawkish soap opera thrown in every now and then to break things up. Everyone fights and shoots like superheroes in this film, totally invulnerable and overpowered, which means that I can't ever accept that the zombies are a serious threat. The action is all just video game run and shoot stuff. Every half an hour or so, the relentless action music will stop and we'll get a bit of Lord of the Rings type slow heavenly choir music, which means that one of our interchangeable superhuman zombie killers is about to die tragically, of course, whilst taking out heaps of zombies along the way. Speaking of music, the score comes from Hans Zimmer's old buddy Tom Holkenborg, aka Junkie XL, who's worked with Snyder a couple of times, usually with Hans Zimmer along with him. If we don't count the Snyder cut of Justice League, then this is the first solo Hulkenborg score for a Zack Snyder movie, and sadly it's not great at all. Totally functional and uncharismatic stuff. There's a couple of weird cover version of pop tunes thrown in as well, which don't really interest me at all. I will say that I am a big fan of Tom Holkenborg's work, usually. I think his score for that very, very underrated Tomb Raider movie with Alicia Vikander is probably some of his best work. But to be honest, the score for Army of Dead, it could be anybody. Although admittedly, there's not much more call for anything other than low ominous drone, frenetic action, heartfelt piano, and sad someone's about to die music. The best scores Snyder snagged over the years have of course been his Zimmer-Hulkenborg collabs for Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman, which got me thinking about what Hans Zimmer would have done with the score for Army of the Dead. I honestly don't think even a kick-ass Hans Zimmer score could have elevated Army of the Dead beyond the crushingly boring. I mean, I've no doubt that Army of the Dead will, of course, find its audience. It's released on Netflix, the biggest streaming platform in the world, and, you know, you will be seeing heaps of people talking about this. I mean, zombies are still popular enough to grab in that key core audience, and Zack Snyder is as popular as he's ever been, courtesy of this group of weird internet obsessives. I personally don't have any problems whatsoever with the release of the Snyder Cut gang, and, you know, more power to them. I'm so fed up of reading about how they're all hateful trolls, because they're not. That's just one of these stupid media lines like man baby or Russian trolls that makes me want to fucking kill somebody. My only problem is about the Snyder Cut crew is, of all the fucking films to want to campaign for, why would you pick a piece of shit like Justice League? I mean, I have seen the Joss Whedon version and I hated it, and no part of me thinks that the idea of sitting down a 4-hour expanded recut version of that would be anything other than hell on earth. I mean, I'm sure it was fucked about with by the studio, but if any part of that original Justice League movie remains, then awful, and from what I can understand, quite a bit of it does remain. But anyway, I just don't particularly like Zack Snyder, but then, if you're going to be making big, stupid movies, then why not make $1 million superhero epics? Personally, I've grown pretty tired of that whole world quite some time ago. All I find myself thinking about when watching a movie like this is what a waste of time and resources it all is. You sit and watch the 10-minute list of names involved in bringing a movie of this scale to the screen, and then you compare that with the fact that only 3 people wrote the script, and you wonder why the whole thing feels so dead. I mean, Army of the Dead is fundamentally an action movie through and through. Gory, zombie-filled action movie, taking place on this big theatrical stage. Everybody involved seems to have taken great pains in getting the visuals to look great, but nobody's wondering whether or not it's worth it in the first place, because it's all just ultimately set dressing for running around shooting zombies. It all feels like a video game to me, which is a shame, especially when you consider that for those of us who've seen the rise of the zombie genre in the first place, that every part of intelligence, subtext, or metaphor has been stripped away, and we're left with shoot the zombies, get the money, pose about in slow motion. It's just a huge bloated, gaudy, run-and-shoot amusement arcade with the most insultingly tokenistic of quote-unquote human moments chucked into the mix. Also, I can appreciate that the zombies do look good, that the ruins of Las Vegas look impressive, and that the idea has got this fun, pulpy vibe to it. None of it is worthwhile, because like the Living Dead dance girls we see in the movie, it's just a very prettified body for something that's long since had every last one of its brain cells rotted away, and is now utterly incapable of speaking to us as human beings. So, 2 stars for Army of the Dead, for its fun comic booky ideas and cool shots of zombies doing their things by themselves. Any scene with human beings in it is a waste of time. It looks good, but it's utterly boring, pointless, long, and very, very loud.
I see you've been at the top of our wait list for some time. You'll face a challenge, since our classes are already underway. As one of the higher-ranked academies in the country, our climate can be quite competitive, especially among seniors like yourself. Even girls who entered as freshmen can sometimes find the stress of their last semester to be too much.
I've worked very hard to be where I am right now, Mrs. Landry.
That's good to hear. It's fortunate that a space has opened up for you here at Edelweiss.
Yes. May I ask what happened? A girl here died?
That's correct, I'm afraid. A terrible accident. One of our students slipped and fell from her window, the poor thing. Tragic.
So let's move on now to Simon Barrett's Séance, released on the 21st of May. Now, Séance comes from the prolific pen of course, Simon Barret, which is both great and kind of a problem. On the one hand, Simon Barret has written some highly regarded films over the years, beginning with 2011's You're Next, before going on to The Guest, segments in anthologies including VHS, VHS2 and the ABCs of Death. And he also did the Blair Witch remake thing, all of which were movies that he wrote scripts for that Adam Wingard directed. But then again, being a good writer means that A, you're not necessarily a great director. Simon Barret directs Séance as well as writing it. And B, it doesn't mean that because you've written some good stuff, that it follows that everything you ever write will be great. You can probably guess where this is going, but let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. Séance is seemingly a pretty straightforward tale about an accidental death at posh girls' boarding school during a séance, and the resultant troublesome spirit that arises in its wake. We follow new girl Camille, played by Suki Waterhouse, as she plays out the familiar new girl arriving at cliquey school stuff before students start getting killed as they probe deeper and deeper into the mysterious death. So Séance is one of those films you don't want to talk too much plot about, because a lot of it hinges upon a pretty basic misdirect, starting out as one thing before turning into another. Suffice it to say, it's light on horror and atmosphere. I mean, one review I read compared it to Suspiria, which, if you're talking about the original or the remake, is insane, because it's nothing like that at all. What it is very light on horror and full of a lot of very privileged youngsters enacting a pretty tepid teen melodrama, with a random jump scare or kill thrown in seemingly at random every now and then. Every single character here seems like a huge cliche. Let me clarify that though. To me, a cliche character only comes across as cliched when they are played by somebody that can't elevate the role to anything more than a bare bones archetype. I don't think any of the characters in Séance are anything but the bare minimum required to be able to tell one person from the next, but none of them feel real or worth investing our time in. I'm going to be honest now, a lot of my problems here do stem from the fact that I'm watching something that's not made for me. This isn't a horror film set in a girls' boarding school, it's a teen girl movie with horror aspects to it, and it sticks so closely to the conventions of that particular genre, the teen genre, that it's hard to know who would be pleased with this film. And yet, at the same time, it's clear that there's some attempt at rug-pulling subversion here, but it isn't startling enough to really make the plodding girls' school cliches seem worth sitting through. Séance doesn't ever break into anything more intense than a gentle trot, and its glacial pace makes it hard to get excited when it does finally start connecting its handful of narrative dots together. Another problem I have is the lead actress Suki Waterhouse. Although she is somebody that's pretty well known, both as a model, actress, and even a general celebrity, she doesn't really cut the mustard with me, although I do admit it's not the best of parts. She's got this kind of affected, aloof disdain that's meant to be cool and deep, but just makes her come off rather snooty and unlikable, and she's meant to be the character that we're rooting for. There's a cluster of interchangeable mean girls that she butts heads with, and they're not really any better either. It's hard to get involved with any of these characters, especially when they seem so restrained all the time. It really does feel like a movie that's made with a teen, or maybe even slightly younger audience in mind, both in terms of its simplicity and its visual discretion in dealing with its adult subject matter, at least until its very last act, when it gets very bloody. I think the problem is this. When you're making a movie about teenagers or young people of any kind, you're trying to tap into the experience of being young. The thing is, everything in Séance feels smooth and airbrushed and clean, with none of that nasty, ugly teenage angst that makes those kind of movies spring to life. Even the worst slasher films at least give us vibrant, believably grungy caricatures of the sex and drugs-obsessed teens. None of the characters in Séance ever come to life as real people, which is a problem because it's more of a character piece than an out-and-out horror. There's no huge horror set pieces for at least the first hour or so, before everything finally gets very messy. And as a horror fan, it doesn't do anything new, but as a general viewer, it's just so incredibly bland and emotionally aloof that by the time you get to the twin catharsis of gore and emotion in the final act, there's a horrible air of, yeah, so what? Simon Barret is a name familiar in horror fandom, and no doubt he'll bring with him an audience. However, I can't help but think that the audience that knows him as the guy that wrote some of Adam Wingard's best films won't find much to love here, which is weird considering that the pair split and Wingard ended up directing Godzilla vs. Kong, whilst Simon Barret is making this movie. That just goes to show you what Hollywood thinks of its writers versus its directors. I'd love to say that Séance is the better movie of the two, because I love championing the underdog, but it's just not great. Bizarrely though, in spite of everything, I didn't hate Séance. It's averagely entertaining, it moves its stiff archetypes about in a fairly familiar fashion before hitting us with a very underwhelming reveal. It does have a few memorable moments of bloodletting that sort of stand out, and it does have a killer wearing a no theatre mask, which is kinda cool. It annoys me reading interviews with Simon Barret that he feels the need to spout all this post-Rian Johnson subverting audience expectation bullshit, because there is nothing at all unexpected in Séance, or even at all original, but I get the sense that Barret kind of thinks that there is. I actually quite liked it because it is so shamelessly unoriginal and unpretentious, but it rumbles along at the level of quite a tolerable TV movie aimed at teenage girls. My verdict is, it's a 2.5-star movie. Totally average, totally not bad, not great, because even though it didn't click with me personally, I can see that it's competent and watchable for the most part. I just wonder what the consensus on this one will be, because it's not a movie that convinces me that Simon Barret is a great director, but there's something about the kind of recognition that he has that makes me wonder how Séance will fare. I mean, I've already seen people reading way too much genre literacy into this movie than it realistically deserves. That Suspiria comparison, for example. And I wonder if people are convincing themselves that they like it more because of Barrett's pedigree. For me, it makes me realise that the balance of talent in all those Adam Wingard, Simon Barret movies, The Guest, Your Next, Blair Witch, etc., probably favoured Wingard more. Hopefully the two of them will get back together sometime soon, because I don't think either of them are doing great solo work. But then I guess now would be a good time to admit that I'm actually not a huge fan of any of their collaborations either. I mean, The Guest's okay, I think Your Next's quite overrated, Blair Witch, good soundtrack, forgettable movie. Sacrilege, I know, but there you go.
You're still not talking to me. We got people to take part in your sound experiment. That's what matters. What? It's my fault? Guy had enough.
These people push themselves, Marie. That's their shtick. You didn't let me push them.
Okay, these people have rules. The most important being we respect their limits. Okay, I know you are this super experimental rad artist with sounds no one has ever heard of, but you haven't even listened to it.
Why would I? I don't think it worked. I didn't get enough.
Well, that's what you get with $100 and people from the internet.
I know, okay? I need powerful sounds.
Just listen to it.
How about we tackle a film called Sound of Violence now, released on the 21st of May. This is an American film directed by Alex Neuer. Now, The Sound of Violence is a big bonkers mess of a film. It concerns a young woman, Alexis, played by Jasmine Savoy Brown, who we learn was born deaf, but recovered her hearing during a traumatic incident in which she witnessed her mother being brutally murdered by her father. However, the key here is that it wasn't the trauma that caused this particular episode, but rather when young Alexis hit back at her father, bludgeoning him to death with a hammer in a bizarre moment of gleeful bloodthirst. Her reaction to giving into her violent side leads to a weird, kind of magical transformation, and suddenly she can hear again. Now, if this seems like lazy plotting, then you'd better bow out now, because things have only just started to get weird. Now something of a musical enthusiast, Alexis seeks to try and capture the sound of violence itself, in an effort to try and recapture the bizarre orgasmic bliss that she experienced when she killed her father, and finally regained her hearing. Her experiments with extreme sound recording soon lead her into very nasty and predictably psychopathic territory as she struggles to get her fix. So first thing to mention here is that The Sound of Violence is based on a short film, as a lot of horror films of a middling budget appear to be these days. The short in this case was Conductor, and was a 6-minute piece with a twist in the tale. I checked it out after having seen Sound of Violence, and I gotta say that even though most shorts aren't as good as the movies that they inspire, think Fried Barry or The Stylist of late, Conductor is fucking awful. And I definitely wouldn't have given the dude who directed that, Alex Neuer, who also writes, more money to spin that shitty little short out to feature length. It's choppy, it's incomplete, badly acted, illogical, and seems to have been put together almost completely at random, which are all things that I could say about The Sound of Violence too. It is weird. I mean, there seem to be so many films, especially horror films, that start off life as shorts, and almost to a one, the shorts really don't offer up anything other than the stylistic taste of what's to come. It's got to be difficult to look at a short and decide that it would be worth expanding it to full length, because often, as is the case with Conductor, there's just not enough there to suggest where a possible full-length movie would go. Best case scenario, I think that shorts act as a kind of sizzle reel, a staged trailer showing what the director is capable of visually and stylistically. Kind of something to show potential investors as opposed to being works of art in their own right. Especially for stuff that's any less than about 10 minutes long, I admit that short films kind of leave me cold. They're all flash and style without much else, and usually a very simple A to B plot structure that usually involves some kind of plot twist a la Conductor, or not even that in the case of the Fried Barry short, which is basically a mood piece. Obviously, there are great short films out there. For example, Anthony Scott Burns, director of The Amazing Come True, made a great short called Lost Boy, which is one of the most visually striking things I've ever seen, and exactly what I'd expect from someone with the flair and style that Anthony Burns has. It's also a short that I could easily see getting expanded into a movie, although the question remains whether or not big screen adaptation is the ultimate end goal of the short film, in the same way that a lot of novels in recent years, especially genre novels, seem designed just to be made into movies. Some shorts work fine on their own, but then others are just these weird little fragments that leave you scratching your head. Most new feature film directors these days will have put out a few shorts already, because they're a good way to get a feel for movie making without having to lock yourself into the behemoth production line nightmare of directing a full-scale feature. Shorts often don't get the love that they deserve, and they remain one of the least celebrated art forms still in regular production. They sort of function as scrapbooks of ideas for directors like Alex Neuer, making the leap to feature directing, acting as rough notes to be expanded upon and worked up into something more coherent. In this case though, I'd have just not bothered. Honestly, I mean, the 6-minute short is awful and makes zero sense if you choose to watch it without watching this movie first, which is really stupid. Whilst Sound of Violence suffers from a lot of the same problems as the short, it also does a lot more, and is actually way more abstract and experimental, both narratively and visually, than the short itself, which is not the usual way around that this kind of thing works. I mean, Sound of Violence is really bonkers, in a way that a lot of films never come close to, and partly this is due to the fact that it's quite hard to work out what kind of a film it actually is. On the surface, it seems to be one of those dreamy indie character pieces that's all about extravagant visuals and off-kilter try-hard acting. A lot of reviews have compared it to the movie Bliss, for example, but I think that's a pretty daft comparison to the overall movie. Because when you dig deeper, you realise that this isn't an indie character movie. It's closer to something like Saw, with the traps replaced by these huge, ludicrous set pieces that feature people being brutally turned into musical performance pieces. Think of those hideous artistic tableaus that you got in the Hannibal TV show, and you'll get more of an idea what we're talking about here, only imagine something a lot crazier and a lot less logically horrific. In actual fact, quite a lot of the set pieces are borderline comedic in how insane they are, even if unintentionally so. Unlike the kind of hideously ironic traps of the Saw franchise, you get instead things that start out life as an idea. They don't really translate to anything workable, possible, or even remotely satisfying, but they are definitely unique. The artistic, you might even say inspired nature of the bloody set pieces and Sound of Violence may be impressive in themselves, even if they all take place in Cloud Cuckoo Land. The biggest problem with the movie overall, though, is that it's that combination of being incredibly serious and emotionally realistic, whilst also being completely ludicrous and impossible. I mean, our lead Alexis isn't a terribly believable, complex serial killer, as much as we're given sequences that want to make us think that she is. For me, the issue here is that in the case of something like Saw or Hannibal, even though those movies are pretty realistic and gruesome in terms of the graphic violence, they operate in a totally fantastical realm of over-the-top theatrical arch-villainry, where the construction of huge elaborate death traps is something that we accept as possible because we're along for the ride, as I mentioned earlier in the Spiral review. Saw to me is 100% bloody comic book storytelling, just pure pulpy, far-fetched adrenaline rush filmmaking. What it is not is a serious look at a serial killer's psychology. The thing is, in Sound of Violence, the contraptions that Alexis rigs up to torture her victims would seem ludicrous in a Saw movie. But there's nothing pulpy or comic booky about the overall tone of the rest of the movie, which is weird. Alexis is a social misfit, she's living in the back of her RV, she may be something of a musical prodigy, as well as being rather obsessive in her pursuit of her sound recording hobby. What she isn't is somebody that we can remotely believe has developed the kind of supervillain technical and medical skills necessary for her to be able to devise elaborate murder machines. There isn't even so much as a line of explanation as to how Alexis has the know-how to do any of the things that she does. Instead, most of her screen time is spent on developing a kind of one-sided, floaty Indian lesbian romance with her one real friend, Marie, who is played by Lily Simmons of Bone Tomahawk fame. And that relationship might either be a totally pointless waste of time, or it might be the key to the whole film. To spice things up and to heighten the similarities with a Saw movie, there's also this police investigation into the deaths that Alexis has caused. Presumably the only reason they felt the need to include an investigative element into things is to remind us that we're watching something that takes place in the real world, a real world where you can't just go around killing indiscriminately, although for all the good that this subplot does overall, seemingly you can. It does include one of my favourite lines, of course, delivered in ultra-serious tones by the token angry, bewildered police detective, who when examining one of Alexis' victims gets to say the line,
"The precision, the overkill. It's not over."
Oh dear. I mean, it's weird thinking about it that Alexis is able to get away with any of this stuff really, given that she seems to put no effort whatsoever into tidying up after herself, and she's just leaving behind bloody messes after each kill and openly acting like a weird psychopath in front of everybody that she knows. There's a scene where she plays a remixed sound recording of one of her murders to a class full of music students that she's teaching, and predictably they all freak out. I mean, I honestly do not know what the character was expecting to happen at this moment. I guess these scenes are meant to show us that Alexis doesn't fit in at all with, quote-unquote normal society, and that what she sees as a perfectly normal quest to capture the sound of violence and create the ultimate musical experience of life and death is actually deeply fucked up and weird. There's a scene early on before Alexis goes full psycho where she's recording the sounds of a dude being whipped by a dominatrix in the effort to capture the sounds of pain, and she's there with her friend, and as the dude's being whipped she keeps saying to hit him harder and harder, and her friend doesn't think this is remotely weird. I mean, it's one of those movies where alarm bells should be ringing from the very beginning, but nobody seems to pick up on anything at all. In a way, I suppose you could say it all plays into the idea that Alexis is becoming desensitized to the mundane, and that the only way that she can really express herself as an artist is by actually killing people. Although the whole correlation between sound and murder is pretty out there, and it doesn't quite come together. In fact, it's actually fairly interesting that Alexis is driven to extremes and can no longer separate the morality of her actions from her desire to create art. That when she tries to deny her own urges to kill and create, she has episodes in which her hearing leaves her entirely. In an early scene, we're told that Alexis' hearing may leave her again for good in the next few years, that the strange event that caused her to regain her missing sense was a bizarre one-off thing that may be temporary. Therefore, what we get is something like a ticking clock for Alexis, who's got to capture the ultimate musical sensation that she seeks before she loses the ability to hear entirely, which drives her to the extremes that we see in the film. It's that same kind of trope that you get in movies where people with cancer stopped caring and do things they wouldn't normally do, I suppose in kind of a Breaking Bad kind of way. The idea that Alexis is a character who doesn't operate with the same sense of morality as the rest of us is actually pretty interesting. She's this genuine, driven creative amidst a sea of bored, distracted nobodies who don't see just how important Alexis's work is. And that's what really gets to me about The Sound of Violence. The more you think about it, the deeper you root about into what it's actually trying to say, the more interesting it seems to be. But then you just step back and remember, okay, this is a movie in which a dude gets turned into a human theremin and has his whole body explode when Alexis hits a high note. You know? It's rare to have so much stupidity and so much seriousness side by side, but to me, there's a deeper problem, which is that I never quite get the idea that this movie knows exactly what it wants to make us feel, or where exactly we're meant to be emotionally at any given point. I think a lot of this problem comes from the fact that the movie opens up with a flashback scene that shows young Alexis seeing her mother killed, before moving on to then kill her father with obvious delight. I think that this would work better if either A, they'd taken out the flashback entirely, or B, they'd interspersed the flashbacks in that kind of saw way into the narrative at key moments. Because the thing is, when we see Alexis kill her father, it's obvious that she isn't really traumatized by having to do so, but instead that she really enjoys doing it, and that's a problem because it straight away makes us realize that there's something wrong with Alexis. Then we jump ahead to Alexis when she's older, and the next act is all about her slowly getting more and more extreme in her urge to capture sounds of violence. She seems pretty normal and even likeable, just very, very driven, and she isn't presented to us as the kind of non-functioning psychopath that she becomes by the end of the movie. But as we know that she's really a killer at heart, we straight away know that in order for Alexis to get what she wants, she has to kill people again, and that makes it pretty hard to sympathise with her. If we were kept in the dark about Alexis's own darker tendencies, then the journey she goes on would be more impactful, instead of this weird thing where we're on the outside looking in, because there's definitely points when we're clearly meant to engage with Alexis as a sympathetic protagonist. I think if you cut out the flashback, or peppered it in bit by bit throughout, then the emotional arc of the movie would be a lot clearer. Alexis speaks about childhood trauma whilst experimenting with sound, when she goes from recording people in pain to ever more extreme sounds, and as she progresses to the point of being a full-blown cold-blooded killer who doesn't care about the morality of her actions. Then we get the full flashback showing us that she was actually responsible for killing her dad. Then later on, we learn that not only was she the killer, but she actually enjoyed it, and that was the formative event in her life that she's been seeking to recapture ever since. That would work way better instead of this weird muddled thing where we're sort of meant to empathise with Alexis, even as she's turning into a full-blown Batman villain with gadgets, secret plans, and a wacky motivation and a unique modus operandi. And whilst I do think there's something quite enjoyable about the various death by music scenes that are throughout Sound of Violence, if they'd been designed in a more realistic way that was less about crazy contraptions and more about a serious attempt to capture the sounds of violence, pain and suffering, then I actually think The Sound of Violence could really have worked. It would have been a lot grimmer and more violent. I mean, the kills would have been less kind of goofy saw traps and more extended, nasty, hostile kind of sequences, which would leave us no doubt as to what kind of a person Alexis really is. And If Alexis's true nature had been plotted out as more of a gradual, carefully staged descent into becoming this ruthless, emotionless killer, rather than just being given to us on a plate at the start then left there as the rest of the movie plays catch-up, then I'd be way more impressed with this movie. I mean, I like its ideas, there's a lot of individual parts in it that are entertaining in their own ways, but the thing is, they don't come together at all. The whole thing is messy as fuck. Perhaps part of this comes from Alex Neuer, director, feeling the need to stick to what was in the short, Conductor, which features a single saw-type contraption. If I was him, I'd have just binned that entirely and started afresh. I think with a serious rewrite, this movie could have worked really well, and the fact that I'm actually thinking about ways that you could fix it, as opposed to just dismissing it as trash, tells you that on some level it did work for me. But it is also a movie riven with issues, from the fundamental that'd never work things to what fucking world is this movie taking place in, huge problems, and even the pretty basic, god that's a bit lame stuff. Again, it's not hugely significant, but I don't really think that Jasmine Savoy Brown as Alexis is any real cop, although I can see that for a film so scattershot in what it's trying to do from one scene to the next, it can have been an easy part to play. She tends to fall back on slightly airy, ditzy but likeable mode for most scenes that don't require any intense emotional stuff, and I can totally buy her as a likeable person, but I get the feeling that there's certain scenes where she's playing the likeable, slightly awkward nerd, when she should really be doing something way more complex to hint that there's more going on to this character under the surface. But I'm guessing that's more the fault of the direction than it is probably the actress. I mean, there's a lot more I could say about Sound of Violence because it is a film that sticks around in your mind, which is more than you can say about a good few of these movies, but I think that should probably do us for now. And the problem is, what do I rate it? If the question was simply, do I recommend it, then the answer is yes, I think you should definitely watch Sound of Violence, if just to say that you've seen it. If it's a question of, do I think it's a good movie or not, then that's a lot harder, because objectively, there's a lot of things wrong with it. It's daft and it's silly and it's all over the place, and parts of it seem to have been written by someone on their way to the moon, because they're just so out there. It's about 2/3 good stuff that shouldn't be mixed together, and about 1/3 just utter nonsense. But nonsense that's kind of fun, although admittedly not always deliberately so. It's a really, really mad film. I actually think that talking about it though, I'm going to do something that I've never done before, which is to up my rating slightly, just to acknowledge the fact that this movie is pretty unique. Initially, after watching it, I thought it was a 2-star film, just because I suppose the bad outweighed the good, but the fact that I was never bored in it and was amazed at just how weird the whole thing was, coupled with the fact that, thinking about it, some of its ideas are actually a little bit better than I might have given them credit for at first, I'm going to bump Sound of Violence up to a full 3 stars. I'm probably going to change my mind again shortly, but for now I think that it is a pretty interesting film, even if it's one with more holes in it than an orchestra's worth of woodwind.
Oh look, it's a lookout point. That's a deer stand. It's a deer stand. During hunting season, people sit up there with a gun. They sit all nice and still until a little deer comes prancing along, and then they shoot it.
How do you know these things?
I had to go hunting with my family when I was a kid to cull the problem deer.
Cull? That's intense.
Oh, yeah. We were there to reduce the population by selective slaughter.
Charming.
Yeah, not really.
So were they a problem, the deer?
That depends on who you ask. I didn't think they deserved to die at all. The worst was that if they didn't get it in the right spot with a bullet, they'd have to slice the animal's throat. Blood just like gushing out everywhere. Yeah, I just wanted to hide, pretend it wasn't happening.
So let's move on to a film that goes by the name of The Retreat now, released on the 21st of May. So, publicity for The Retreat proudly trumpets the fact that this is a lesbian slasher movie, when in actual fact that's only half true. The central characters are absolutely lesbians, and this is an important plot point without which the events of the movie might never take place, but to call it a slasher film is something of a misuse of that term. For my money, it isn't a slasher film at all, but closer to one of those mid-2000s torture porn light movies about capture, confinement, and killing for entertainment. Our lead characters, lesbian couple Valerie, played by Sarah Allen, and Renee, played by Tommy Amber Price, are coasting along slightly awkwardly in their relationship, and figure that taking some time out at a gay B&B, which is their terminology and not mine, will help them sort their heads out. Of course, nasty stuff starts to happen to them, and soon they're fighting for their lives. There's an early shot of a dead animal on a roadside in Pat Mills' The Retreat, which is obviously meant to conjure up the spectre of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and there are certain similarities, at least on a superficial level, to certain aspects of what The Retreat is going for. Deep down, though, it is a very, very different movie. And for the record, the director, Pat Mills, of this movie is not the Pat Mills of 2000 AD, just thought I'd mention that. Unfortunately, The Retreat is a very plodding, by-the-numbers, running-around-in-the-woods movie that coasts along on having found a microscopic little niche for itself, but it seems that the focus of this movie is far more on sociopolitics than it is on working as a horror film or even as a thriller. It's not especially heavy-handed or crude. I mean, it doesn't resort to tub-thumping or characters spouting lazy political speeches, but it just doesn't hang together as a cohesive piece of drama. It's one of those films that feels almost apologetic with its horror elements, and as a result it doesn't bring any atmosphere or intrinsic understanding for the language of cinematic horror. So what we get is something that's fairly mundane with a few nasty splashes of sadism thrown in for good measure. I mean, every bit of promotional material I was coming across about this movie involved discussions about the lack of well-rounded lesbian characters on screen, especially in horror. And that, to me, seems like the sort of thing that people say who don't really watch much horror. The problem with making a movie about an issue is that if the movie itself isn't great, then you're doing your cause no real favours, and The Retreat is just about the very definition of a bland, by-the-numbers, running around in the woods, diet, torture porn movie that just happens to have lesbians in it. But let's step back here for a moment and go back to something we've touched on earlier, which is The Retreat really isn't great, but it's not terrible. I think that to a seasoned horror watcher it comes across as old hat and does absolutely nothing new. However, to a gay audience that is wary about the horror genre because of its largely unfair reputation for misogyny, then it's possible that this might work for them. Like the gay B&B in this movie, putting the effort into making sure that the gay characters here are treated tastefully and respectfully, and advertising this fact, means that this is a film that could potentially act as a gateway movie for wary lesbians that want to give horror a go. To those people, I can only say that please do not think all horror is this formulaic. There's so much better stuff out there than this. I mean, for one thing, I really don't find the lead couple all that likeable. The early scenes that are designed to show their awkwardness feel kind of stagey and show neither character off in a good light. Then there's some very clunky foreshadowing courtesy of a speech about deer hunting from Renee that should definitely clue you into where this is all going. Actually, most of the opening act's character dialogue feels like wasted time, but sadly it's a film that never feels like it quite gets where it wants to go to, and never engages with anything other than on the level of regurgitating scenes and ideas we've all seen before. Unoriginality is fine, but unfortunately there's no real spark to bring it all to life, and the end result is you get a film where you can say, hey look, not all lame horror movies need to star straight couples. I mean, I know it's a cheap rhetorical tool, but if this movie was about a straight couple, well, A, it wouldn't have been made, but B, if somehow it had, then it would be jaw-droppingly forgettable, I mean, actually painfully mundane. By the end, it does tip slightly into angry wish-fulfillment fantasy, as all the bad homophobes are gruesomely made to pay for their intolerance. The whole situation just never feels real enough to warrant much engagement with our characters getting their revenge. The villains of the piece don't have that horribly believable edge to them like the nasties in something like Deliverance, but nor are they painted with the theatrical, nightmarish vibrancy of the Chainsaw Clan, for example. They're just baddies, doing bad things to the goodies, a little bit of nasty torture, running around shooting, pulling faces, and being baddies. In fact, it's weird that for a film that sets out to be all about positive representation, that the goodies of the piece are all characterised by their sexuality, whereas the baddies are all characterised by their homophobia. I think of recent memory, the movie that The Retreat comes closest to is probably The Boonies. Now, it's not as painfully amateurish as The Boonies, and its characters don't make me want to jam sharp objects into my eyes like the cunts in that movie did, but The Boonies had one really memorable scene of threat in it that works better as a horror set piece than anything in The Retreat. Retreat. In fact, it's more of a nasty thriller than a horror film. The problem is, there's just nothing in The Retreat that really sticks in the mind, no matter how attuned to the film's brand of identity politics you are. I mean, I hate really crappy flag-waving tokenistic message movies an awful lot, and The Retreat isn't that at all, no matter what its marketing might make you think. But sadly, it's just not very good. I think, to be fair, I'd give it 2 stars out of 5. It's not a slasher movie, but more of a gay why are you doing this movie, about nasty homophobes acting out the same movie we've all seen loads of times before. And yes, the lead character does say, why are you doing this, which shows you what school of cliché this particular movie leans towards. It's crazy how many films still use the why are you doing this line, despite how often it gets trotted out in films with even the slightest suggestion of someone being tied up and tortured, and I have to say, I'm pretty fed up of it.
It's been over 20 years since that night, but these questions about ghosts are still stuck in my head. It's become a part of my life. Then last night happened. You and I saw a ghost together. And I know that I really did see my father that night. It's like the one question I've been asking my entire life has finally been answered. Think about it, man. If I can find a way for others to see ghosts the way that we did, what would happen? I think I was born to prove to the world that ghosts are real. Count me in.
Now let's head back to Netflix now for a film that goes by the name of Ghost Lab, released on the 28th of May. As I've mentioned before, foreign horror films always intrigue me, because as much as we might want to think that we're one big international family, all the same underneath, actually, different countries and different cultures look at the world in very different ways. That means that their art can often approach similar subjects in totally unique ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Quite often, I think that a lot of horror subgenres seem played out, as film narratives get more and more to the stage where what we're watching is just a flimsy idea propped up by a load of self-referential swipes from other, better movies. For example, I think that no matter how many more new slasher movies I watch, I'll never end up watching a better slasher than John Carpenter's Halloween. And any movies that follows in its footsteps will probably end up directly or indirectly referencing that film. But what I actually mean is that I'm getting tired of a particular view of filmic reality, one that's shaped by a shared cultural heritage of horror cinema, American movies in particular, that usually share a commonality of approach. That's why to me foreign movies always feel fresh, because they don't assume that shared cultural shorthand. It's like being allowed to see things from a completely new perspective. No matter how many foreign films you watch, you'll always get that feeling of freshness just because American cinema remains so all-pervasive. Even though Ghost Lab is available thanks to a Netflix deal, it's a movie that comes from Thailand. I admit it once again, I'm no expert when it comes to Thai movies, horror or otherwise, which means that in a way, Ghost Lab has a lot more of a weight of expectations on it, acting as an ambassador for its national cinema. I'm about 98% sure that I've never seen a horror film from Thailand before, which means that now, when I'm faced with the prospect of watching a horror movie from Thailand again in the future, I've got an image of something in my head. Ghost Lab is a pretty nuts and bolts title, I've got to say, and one that sounds so pedestrian it's hard to kind of sell it to somebody else. Much in the same way that I imagine the phrase Star Wars must have sounded a little bit naff and on the nose in 1977, Ghost Lab just sounds so horribly basic. In fact, it's not even an original title. There was a reasonably short-lived supernatural reality show about ghost hunters that went by the same name, Ghost Lab, in 2009 and 2010. So what we've got with Ghost Lab is we're following 2 handsome young doctors, Dr. Gla and Dr. Wee. Gla is the cocksure funster, whilst Wee is the glasses-wearing one who's a bit more socially awkward, who cares deeply for his mother, who's in a permanent coma at the hospital in which the 2 doctors work. One day, seemingly out of the blue, they witness a ghost, a reanimated burn victim, come to life, and the next thing we know, the 2 doctors have dedicated themselves to trying to study the whole paranormal phenomenon in the most rigorously scientific way possible, each for their own reasons which I'm not going to spoil here. Their pet projects soon developed into a burning obsession, one which will test the bonds of the 2 doctors' friendships in shocking and unexpected ways. Now, Ghost Lab runs 2 hours, and it covers an awful lot of story ground, narratively and emotionally. And if you compare it to Netflix's other, bigger, more talked about horror release of this month, Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead, which is a lot longer and manages to be about running around shooting zombies for a very long time, the difference is that Ghost Lab is amazing. I admit that I had zero expectations going into this film, but weirdly, what I was expecting was a horror comedy, maybe in a kind of Reanimator type fashion, given that everything that I'd seen about Ghost Lab beforehand mentioned that it was a horror comedy. Once more, I can only say, what film were the people saying that watching? Did they switch off after the first 15 minutes or something? I mean, sure, there is some quirky character comedy in the opening act, but it's all the kind of natural humour that comes from dialogue, not out and out wink wink comedy. It's all about getting to know the characters, and initially things are good, so they're happy. But Ghost Lab is, I'd say, 100% not a comedy by any means. It's actually a very emotional film that manages to manipulate the fuck out of your emotions without ever feeling emotionally manipulative, which is something very hard to pull off indeed. The characters feel real and likeable, even though things are very heightened. I think both actors do a great job. Unfortunately, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce their names, which are very long and complex, and I apologise deeply to the lads in question, but these are some of the most vivid and memorable protagonists I've seen in a long time, and throughout the whole film, sure, there's other people orbiting the two doctors' lives, but for the most part it's a film about a friendship between two very intelligent and charismatic characters, played by intelligent and charismatic actors. It's also a wonderfully stylish film that manages to squeeze as much drama out of a plot that's built on these huge dramatic pivot points as Doctors Glah and Wee pinball about from one revelation to the next, as they delve deeper into trying to solve the unsolvable problem as to how to prove that ghosts are real. There are moments of genuine jaw-dropping amazement in Ghost Lab that got me making noises about how awesome it all was, and that's not something I do much. Even though the subject matter is fairly familiar, as I've said before, the joy is in the fact that it feels fresh in this case, because it's handled in such a way that prioritises every single moment to build up to another dramatic or emotional crescendo. It's a big, shamelessly vibrant character drama that makes us feel everything we're seeing matters more than anything else ever will again and again. In a way, it's got something like the feeling of an anime about it, where everything is very heightened and dramatic, and there are shots that look like manga panels, where an image is presented to us as a still moment dripping with drama, beautifully composed to make sure that we understand how important everything is. It'd be unfair for me to plot out the various swings and moods that Ghost Lab passes through, but let's just say that it starts out as something fun and exciting and kinetic before becoming increasingly more serious as it progresses. There's a lot of serious subject matter dealt with along the way, but it all comes down to such an amazingly human story that's played out for all it's worth. If I did have any complaints, they'd be more with the horror elements. Ghost Lab isn't a hard horror film in the sense that it's a film about ghosts. It's more of a paranormal drama with some emotionally disturbing sequences. There are some moments that play more into slightly tropey horror territory, including sadly a bit near the end. It's actually not that the horror isn't effective, because it is, it's just that it goes a little too far in one direction and asks us to temporarily suspend our investment in our protagonists and replace it with a series of more formulaic horror scares. I can't really be any more specific than that, but when Ghost Lab looks it's most like an average horror film near the end, I find it hard to connect with the emotions of that sequence, given how intense the emotions have been leading up to all that stuff. Not that I'm saying that it's got a bad ending, because it's actually got a really, really great ending. Because I don't want to spoil it at all, I'm going to say no more, but I'd have certainly trimmed a certain leg-based sequence, if you know what I mean. It just feels a little bit too button pushy for me. In a way, it shares certain grounds with Come True, my favourite film of the year so far, in that Come True was about trying to understand dreams, with science probing into something dark and primal that it shouldn't have interfered with, whereas Ghost Lab is about science tackling another taboo, which is life after death. Both are great mysteries that mankind has always been fascinated with. We've always wanted to be able to understand dreams, and we've always been obsessed with the idea that ghosts are real, that the spirit can live on after death. Whilst Come True was profoundly disturbing and felt like we were genuinely seeing something that we weren't meant to see, Ghost Lab is more shamelessly emotional, and the joy and excitement comes from the quest of seeing intellectual titans, our likeable leads, putting their minds to solving the problem scientifically, and so much care and attention is put into making our leads live as real people that we can't help but buy into their hopes and dreams, which make the movies a series of dramatic pivot points work. I can buy the twists because I care for the characters, so well written and so well acted that they are. Of course, it's no surprise that I loved Ghost Lab, although it succeeds less as a a horror film for me than as an intense character drama. It sounds so basic to say this, but it's just great seeing something this unashamedly melodramatic and committed to telling its story in the most stylish and emotional way possible. Based on the strength of this, I can say that I'd love to give Thai horror a go again, although I know that just because I watched one great horror film from Thailand doesn't mean that all their stuff is great. But as the sole representative of an entire culture of horror films that I've never seen before, Ghost Lab is good enough to make me want to see more. Sadly though, I think it's worth mentioning that I have seen a lot of poor, sniffy reviews for Ghost Lab when looking around, which confirms the point that I've always thought, which is that a lot of critics, especially Western critics, judge films based on whether or not they match up to a set of criteria that have been pre-established as deserving of merit. Does it deal with this issue? Are these characters treated in a certain way? Does it represent this or that? All based upon this Western-centric idea of what matters and what is unimportant. Part of the reason that I love Ghost Lab is because it never feels like a movie designed to tick boxes in a way that a lot of Western movies do. In fact, it's unlikely that a movie like Ghost Lab could ever be made by an American or European director. The characters are too bold and too likeable without enough neuroses, and the emotional scenes don't ever feel like formulaic character arcs in the way that emotional scenes in Western films do. There isn't that feeling like the director's trying to make high art that just happens to be a horror film, and the end result is that Ghost Lab feels more genuine and three-dimensional and emotional than movies that devote 90% of their runtime to dissolving interpersonal relationships and chuck in cheap jump scares just to spice things up. I'm personally a little bit tired of the post-Ari Aster Jordan Peele approach to horror, in part just because it seems like so many films are taking those filmmakers' own unique styles as the rulebook that they have to follow and working from there. That's not the way to make great art, just by copying what's popular. There's also a load of sniffy reviews I've read which have all said the same thing, which is that this movie starts off as a horror comedy, then loses its way. It's that thing where crappy reviewers just look at what big sites say and then parrot it without thinking in the hopes of fitting in. I take issue with those reviews not because they're largely of the thumbs down variety, but because they're factually inaccurate. Just because there's a few moments of character comedy to start off with doesn't mean that this is a horror comedy. If that was the case, then you could argue that Wes Craven's Last House on the Left was a horror comedy, because it's got scenes in it that are a lot more out and out comedy than anything in Ghost Lab, although it's also a hell of a lot grimmer too. It's a tonal arc that pivots naturally from playful enthusiasm when the two doctors are starting out to something that gets gradually more serious and intense, not this weird tonal whiplash thing that reviewers seem to be saying en masse. Once things get serious, it never goes back to being light, it follows the beats of the story naturally. Speaking of Western audiences, it's interesting. I watched this on Netflix and the default setting was the dubbed version, but rather than watching the more faithful original audio with English subtitles version, what I did was watch it with English audio and the subtitles on, which is basically the equivalent of reading a heavily footnoted translation, in that you can hear what the dubbers are saying whilst also being able to compare each line with the original, more faithful translation. It is mildly distracting, but like I say, it didn't ruin my enjoyment whatsoever. I think it's a good dub overall, unless you're distracted by, of course, mismatched lip movements. I mean, it's not one of those dubs that misses the point of the original at all, but it's entirely up to you how you want to watch it. I'd say both versions are valid, but the purist in me says that if I was to watch it again, which I certainly would like to, I'd probably go for the original audio with subtitles. One thing that I did find interesting with the compare and contrast approach was how often the dubbing felt the need to stick in F-bombs when the original features very, very little gratuitous swearing, although there are a few moments of non-gratuitous swearing in moments when it totally makes sense for characters to swear. It just goes to show you how we feel as a society that in a post-Tarantino age, believable character dialogue consists of people saying fuck a lot. But all in all, Ghost Lab is such a great film, a rich, totally focused story of these two doctors on their journey into very dark places, and for the sheer gamut of emotions that it plays with, I have to say that it's one of my favourite films of the year so far. I really feel like Western horror movies have got so caught up with things that aren't as important as we think they might be, and have kind of lost the ability to just tell a great story in a moving and human fashion. Sure, there's more to Ghost Lab than great characters and likeable performances. There's also a lot of meditation on life and death, grief and loss and friendship, and and dreams, but focusing on subtext over the mechanics of drama is, to me, putting the cart before the horses, something that Ghost Lab absolutely does not do. It fires on all cylinders and excels at everything that it does. It's got a soundtrack that's used to perfection, one that understands the emotions of every scene that it features in and really makes everything shine. For me, Dr. Glah and Dr. Wee are two of the most memorable characters of the year in horror so far for me, and overall I've got to give Ghost Lab just short of a perfect score, which is a 4.5 stars out of 5. It loses just a fraction of its perfect score because it's some stuff that I can't really go into, stuff to do with one character going a little bit too far in a key scene that just drags on a little bit too long, so it stops being a sequence that makes dramatic sense and just becomes a bit of a bland horror set piece. But still, at 4.5 stars, I can assure you, Ghost Lab is an amazing film and one of my favourite horrors of the year so far.
What the fuck is going on here?
Isn't it obvious?
Who are you? What is this place? What the fuck are you? The question is not what am I, but it's what are you? All of you.
I want to go home.
Now see, Ola, this is your home now. Except only one of you will ever leave. Hey, come on!
Why are you telling that?
All will be revealed in due time.
But until then, you will continue to live in the house until another vote is tallied and another challenge is met.
If you refuse to participate, if you try to escape,
if you do not comply in any way,
a fate far worse than Nevin's awaits, I assure you.
The horror and the pain
will be unlike anything you could possibly imagine.
So you must complete your obligation and finish what you've started. So put on a happy face.
Get the audience on your side.
Win their hearts and, more importantly, their votes, for your fate is in their hands. Now would you all please kindly adjourn to the Funhouse. Have yourselves a drink. You've earned it.
Especially you, Lonnie.
So let's close things out now with a film from Canada. This is a movie that goes by the name of Funhouse, released on the 28th of May. This is another one of those YouTube internet reality star kind of horror films wherein a large group of YouTube personalities are brought together in a Big Brother style house wherein they're made to compete for a huge sum of money. But the twist here is that when it comes to booting out the losers, they're dispatched with in a range of bloody, gimmicky challenge set pieces, all streamed to the watching masses via the internet. The group gets whittled down, and as it does, the motives of the madmen behind it all start to become clear. There can only be one winner, so the question is, what are this lot willing to do to win the deadly game? So the interesting thing about a movie like Funhouse is that no matter how hard it tries to spice things up and look modern, chances are it'll probably end up looking out of date by the time it hits your screens. However, the thing is that although the lead characters in this movie are all YouTube personalities, and though, as I've mentioned before, if ever there was a time to make an angry horror film about the horrors of modern media-obsessed living, it would be now. Funhouse is nothing new. I'm not just talking about the evil Big Brother setup or the ever-increasing amount of horror films that feature YouTubers as their lead characters. I'm talking about the whole critique of the media and the people that consume it and the vacuousness of people involved in all aspects of it. The idea of broadcasting torture as entertainment is something that a Doctor Who nerd like me can trace back to the mid-1980s with Vengeance on Varos, which could be interpreted either as a critique of the 80s video nasties or of our desensitization to violent imagery on broadcast media. The point is that no matter if the set dressing's been updated to the latest technological ideas, there have always been films that have done what Funhouse set out to do, and sadly that means that in its scenes of quite blatant explaining the writer's viewpoints, where our lead villain rails against modern internet-obsessed society, it's the sort of stuff we've all heard before. That said though, I do like this kind of thing, and the more over-the-top and satirical it is, usually, the better it is. I mean, making films that attack our cultural obsessions is always something that I think leads to passionate art. The problem is that pointed satire and something that's ploddingly didactic are a lot closer to each other than most people realise, and you need to make sure you're making your point intelligently and not just dumping an inert diatribe on your viewers. I think the best satirical horror of the year so far was, of course, Elsa Kephart's Slacks, the anti-consumerist movie about killer genes on a bloody rampage. Sadly, I think that Funhouse falls very short, although it does give it a go. So my first problem with Funhouse is its characters. Now, to my mind, that whole social media YouTube reality reality star thing, the kind of people that we get here, are utterly insufferable, twisted perversions of humanity's worst excesses. I hate them all. That means that, in theory, a movie about a bunch of inane YouTubers being tortured and killed off gruesomely should be my idea of a fun time. It's the same argument that people make about slasher films where they say that the characters are so annoying that you want to see them all brutally killed off. My issue with this is that if they're really that fucking unbearable, why do I even want to spend time with them in the first place? And Funhouse suffers from that in that the whole first half hour or so is just getting to know our characters doing their things, and because they're all YouTubers and all acting like they think they're in a reality show, it means we have to put up with a lot of really awful stuff, because YouTubers of this kind are all just attention whores with a range of horrifying personality disorders. I just can't buy into a film like this where I hate all of the characters no matter how much I'm meant to, which is a problem for me. Even though the YouTubers in Funhouse are presented in all their hideously insincere glory, and even though the movie is kind of against what they represent, it still expects us to start caring for them when things start to get nasty. That's a shaky foundation for me to build a film upon because I don't sympathise with them. And to me, giving us character scenes where we're meant to empathise with these characters kind of undermines the whole point of this film. I think the real life version of this gang wouldn't band together like the characters in Funhouse do, but would happily slit each other's throats for money and victory and their time in the limelight. And that's the next problem I've got with Funhouse, which is that it feels muddled in what it's actually trying to say, and even in the very mechanics of its situation. For example, the whole reality show format starts off as being called Fercus's House of Fun, before randomly changing later into just being called Funhouse. Why? No idea. Then there's the huge amount of techno-babble that goes into explaining how the Funhouse show remains available to the entire world on the internet, and how the FBI or other authorities haven't been able to shut it down, which is fair enough in that I obviously don't understand any of it, and even though I'm sure that if I tried I could probably find a hole in the explanation pretty easily, it works in the world of this film. But what I've got more of an issue with is this: if you're one of the people tuning in to watch Funhouse, what exactly are you watching? We see these recurring little kind of vignettes of people that the movie cuts back to at key points, as in Vengeance on Varos, where they react to the events on screen, usually during key moments. But even the promise that someone's going to die soon seems to overlook the fact that a lot of the time watching Funhouse must just be looking at a room full of depressed people moping about and occasionally arguing. It's all very well making the point that we're so desensitized that we'd happily watch something like this without really caring about the lives of the people involved, but on a more basic level, Funhouse would be insanely boring to watch and probably wouldn't garner the media attention that it actually does. Then there's this whole kind of Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns thing going on, where we get a regular media commentary on what's going on, a lot of which involves a YouTuber with a channel called Pete's Sake, who basically dismisses everything as being a cheap hoax even when people are dying before his eyes. And bizarrely, that seems a lot more of a realistic reaction to something like this. I mean, the truth is that there just isn't such a thing as a global media phenomenon anymore, especially not a real-time one like this, because we're also fractured in what we do with our time, what we choose to watch, and where we watch it. The fact that Funhouse is all this huge semi-legal thing that small kids can seemingly tune into and watch, but that the FBI can't stop people from accessing, it just seems crazy to me. And obviously, any film that deals with technology these days needs to involve a degree of bullshit in it, and you just kind of accept what's telling you that it's necessary for you to believe in order for the drama to function, and that is fair enough. If we accept events on screen as taking place in a world of fantasy technology, totally unrealistic media consumption, then the next problem is, just what is this guy setting out to do with his challenges? Again, a lot of reviewers have described this aspect of Funhouse as being Saw-like, which is totally unfair to Saw. Although it's interesting to note how many supposed Saw-type movies we're suddenly getting in the wake of a new official Saw installment hitting the big screen. But the thing is, Saw traps, as I've mentioned, always were wildly over-designed, sure, but there was always that delicious EC Comics type irony to them that you could appreciate where each trap was tailored to an aspect of the personality of the individual involved, and they worked as these theatrical set pieces. What's the point of any of the challenges in Funhouse? They play out more as these slightly ghoulish gladiatorial challenges, but there's nothing ironic or well-designed about the way that they work, and it's hard to see why exactly our villainous manipulator has chosen the things that he has. has. They're actually a pretty lackluster assortment of murder scenarios, although there are some splashy moments of bloodshed, most impressive probably being the old favourite death by rack. Although the kill scenes overall do lose points for falling back on just shoving on heavy metal music whenever anything nasty starts happening, which is a cliche that I personally detest in cheap horror films. And speaking of music, Funhouse opens with that old favourite of ours, the inimitable Ludwig van's Moonlight Sonata, one of the most evocative bits of music ever written. Sadly, it's used as that old cliche of the he must be a psychopath because he listens to classical music, although it also is meant to show that our villain has a taste for the finer things in life, hence his anger at all these youngsters and their goddamn YouTubing. Interestingly, the opening scene's quite strange, and I'm not entirely sure that it actually makes a lot of sense when you relate it back to the rest of the film. Basically, it starts off with this dude sitting back, looking bored, whilst two women fight to the death in front of him. He then makes the victor cut out the loser's heart, which he does, then he gives her a load of money, and she seems pretty okay with it all. It's an opening scene that says that if you give people enough money, then they'll do anything no matter how immoral. Then, presumably, the woman just leaves with the money and is pretty chill. We don't see her for the rest of the movie, though. But what I don't get is that if that's how the movie starts out, then it suggests that the gang of obnoxious YouTubers that he assembles, presumably for his own entertainment, are more virtuous than most people would be, given that they're not willing, or indeed ever even asked, to turn against each other for money. The whole dog-eat-dog aspect seems totally missing from Funhouse, when I feel that that should have been what this was all about. It also nicks its final twist from at least two other post-Saw torture porn movies that I can think of, at least one of which this film actually parallels quite closely, but I think that if I told you what film it was, then that would kind of ruin the ending. Suffice it to say that the end is no great cop, and I think that by about the halfway mark, it's lost all pretense of being a film with anything legit to say, and it just coasts along, whittling down its cast members one by one. What we're left with is dumb, violent spectacle, and while some of the gore does its job, I think the whole setup does feel lackluster, and I don't think the challenges have any sense of internal tension to them in the way that a Saw trap does. It's strange actually that whilst our lead villain here, represented to the participants in Funhouse as a nightmarish CGI motion capture panda, is actually meant to be a fiendishly intelligent, resourceful technology genius with all the resources of the world at his fingertips, who can do anything and design anything. But his challenges usually consist of little more than the cheapest, most simplistic apparatus imaginable, whereas other protagonists this month in movies like Spiral and Sound of Violence, with almost nothing in the way of resources, were able to conjure up huge complex marvels of technology to torture their victims. Sadly, the end result is that Funhouse just is not any fun at all. As much as the idea of a film like this appeals to me, I just don't feel like Funhouse knows where to go, and fails as both a spectacle or as a cautionary tale. It's incredibly far-fetched without any of the pulpy charm that comes from embracing the unlikeliness of everything on screen, whilst also being too muddled to make its point in anything but the most obvious of ways. It does have some residual entertainment value. It's not quite as dismal as some of this year's other vlogger horrors like Stay, for example, and it does feature someone unironically using the phrases opiate of the masses and Kardashianization of society. But it really does pussy out when it comes to delivering its social commentary, which is a big negative in my book. Funhouse gets 2 stars out of 5 for me, a lot of which is for unrealised potential, although I think if your tolerance for that whole world of self-promotion and media whoring that you get with YouTubers and their like is higher than mine, you probably won't have such an issue with these characters being played more for sympathy than as grotesque parodies, which I think they should have been. That would have been a Funhouse that I might actually have tuned in for. Well, that should wrap things up for now. Thanks for sticking around, and now it only remains for me to rattle through the ratings rundown from worst film to best film and to give out the monthly awards for the best in show. So I guess we should start things out with the bottom of the barrel. Interesting to note that compared to last month, which was pretty bottom heavy, we've only got one movie this month that makes it into the bottom 10 of the year so far, and even then, it's actually a film that's not that bad at all. So out of the 14 films of May 2021 that I've seen, the wooden spoon has to go to, sadly, Brian Farmer's morality tale of medical ethics gone rogue, Blue Call. As I've said, it's far from a dud, but its pacing is just bad and it's really just ended up feeling woolly and all over the place. There's no question of fun here. This is a serious horror thriller, but there's just not enough happening here to keep the attention. It's very cheap and very brittle, and one that it would be pretty easy to find yourself dropping off in. So number 14, coming in at 1.5 stars, is Blue Call. Number 13 next, a few spots above Blue Call in the yearly rankings, but also coming in at 1.5 stars, is Louisa Warren's The Tooth Fairy, The Last Extraction. More fun by its very nature than Blue Call. Tooth Fairy 3's got charm and a game cast, but it's just too shoddy to really get away with being deserving of any praise. Weirdly, unlike most films that have got cheap, crappy actors filling in the stuff between the gore or the kills, Tooth Fairy has decent human drama and acting, but it's the scenes of the Tooth Fairy herself in action that really let Tooth Fairy 3 down. 1.5 stars for Tooth Fairy The Last Extraction, the second poorest film of the month. At number 12, we've got the lowest ranked of a couple of 2-star films, and that is The Djinn. There's a lot you can do with the basic idea of subverting the wish-granting fairy tale trope to dark ends, but The Djinn is painfully bare bones and ends up feeling cheaper and a lot more claustrophobic than stuff that costs more than it. It's got a pretty good score, and the first half hour or so sets the premise up nicely, but then nothing interesting happens for the rest of the film. I'd say skip The Djinn and watch the 1990s classic Wishmaster again, or for the first time if you haven't seen it already. Next up at number 11, also at 2 stars out of 5, is the film that calls itself the lesbian slasher movie, but it's actually just a pretty dull lesbian horror movie in the woods, about nasty homophobic rednecks torturing gay people. That is, of course, The Retreat. Again, really bare bones, and you will hear people who have been tied up shouting, "Why are you doing this?" which must be one of the most overused tropes in horror, just below people complaining that there's no cell phone signal. Not much goes on in The Retreat other than the pretty basic capture, escape, and revenge. It's a Canadian movie, which means it's slightly more stylish and less aggressively political than an American film would be, but unfortunately, it's just unbelievably pedestrian and predictable. So 2 stars for The Retreat at number 11. So breaking into the top 10 of the month, we come to Antidote, the medical horror film that's not really a medical horror film. It's full of great ideas about the evils practiced in the name of science. Antidote could have been the kind of movie that transcended its obvious cheapness and really hit home with a brutal, timely message. Unfortunately, it's not that at all, and I think that the last line of Antidote might be the angriest that I got out of film all month, because it's such a cowardly cop-out. Throw in the most obvious twist in the world and some really hideous CGI, and you've got a real duffer on your hands. The more I think about it, actually, the less I like Antidote, and I'm already thinking that my rating of 2 stars might be a lot more generous than it deserves. At number 9, we've got another Canadian joint, which is, of course, the film Funhouse, all about live streaming the torture of a group of YouTubers. Well, as fun as that sounds, Funhouse never quite has the courage to embrace its potential for satire, and instead resorts to basic speechifying to condemn our media-obsessed age, which is fair enough, but as a movie, it's pretty half-baked, and it's too basic to be a gory good time, and plays things way too safe to really get to grips with its ideas of YouTubers as immoral fame whores. Funhouse gets 2 stars as well, and will be filed under the Could Be Better tab forevermore. Number 8 is a film that I'm sure some people will have been looking forward to, and that is, of course, Simon Barrett's Séance. Here we get to see a well-known genre writer promoted to the director's chair for a pretty empty little haunted girls' school movie that's got one trick up its sleeve which I will not reveal here. I know it's a location that invites a degree of archetypal storytelling, but there's also a load of girls' school horrors that are really great. Stuff like Suspiria, Picnic at Hanging Rock, and Winter for the Adept. The problem is that the characters in Séance are of the ultra-posh variety and seem so stiff and rarefied it's nearly impossible to sympathise with them or accept them as real people. It's really bland, reasonably competent, but it's one of those films that will probably have a lot more to offer you if you're a teenage girl than if you're a hardcore horror fan. Séance gets 2.5 stars from me, a pretty solid thumb in the middle. Number 7, we've got another 2.5-er, and that is Full Moon's Don't Let Her In, the throwback erotic horror thriller that's as straightforward as they come, but it's got some nice touches and it does rattle merrily along. I admit a lot of my affection for this particular film comes from the fact that it's the most legit thing that Full Moon has put out for some time. Although they're not in the big leagues yet, Ditch the stoner gags and the softcore titillation, and make something a little more boldly adult and less juvenile, and Charles Band's gang could go places. For a 60-minute movie, Don't Let Her In doesn't waste its time, and it's nice to see another entry into the ever-growing list of horror films whose titles start with the word don't. Don't Let Her In gets 2.5 stars from me, a solid, kind of goofy throwback movie. So here's where it starts getting a little bit muddled. So coming in at number 6 is a film that I gave only 2 stars, but which on reflection I probably had a better time with than the 2 previous entries, even if I still had enough problems with it that I couldn't bring myself to rate it any higher than 2 stars. At number 6 is Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead, a film that I can't in all conscience rate any higher than 2 stars out of 5. And whilst I think I enjoyed Séance and Don't Let Her In more, I can also see that objectively Army of the Dead is a more impressive piece of filmmaking. Personally, I don't care for either Zack Snyder or for the run and shoot zombie film, so I can see that I'm not the target audience for this kind of thing, but I just can't get over how unlikable all the characters are and how flimsy the whole plot is, from motivation to execution and to the way scenes play out. The acting is, I think, pretty awful all round. None of these characters have the emotional truth that even the characters in something like the Tooth Fairy 3 have got, and it's such a gaudy, ugly waste of time. However, for a 2.5-hour video game made for a disgustingly huge sum of money and shot with the eye of somebody shooting a great big advert, there's invariably a few money shots that do stick in your mind that are unique if nothing else. It's a great big stupid action film, but it does have some pretty pictures in between the hideously artificial emotional scenes and the shaky run and shoot set pieces. So 2 stars for Army of the Dead, best served loud and to somebody whose brain's been switched off. Coming into the top 5 of the month now, still sticking with the 2.5 star gang, and it's a fun, fuzzy-headed little movie by the name of Rink, which is a pretty discreet slasher film set in a skating rink. It's more or less just about a bunch of doofuses hanging out. It's more fun than it should have been. The low-budget cast have got to use every bit of charisma they can muster, which is a lot more than you'd expect, and though it's never going to realistically go down in history as one of those must-see slashers, Rink is just a bit of fun, although don't expect outrageous gore or kills. Moving on to number 4 now, with an almighty 3 stars out of 5, we've got one of the weirdest films of the year so far. Not weird in terms of being surreal or wacky, but just weird as in what the fuck are they doing? And that is a film full of problems, but one that's pretty memorable nonetheless. It is Sound of Violence. This is the one that's probably going to fluctuate a lot for me just because it's such a unique mindfuck of a film. It flails about randomly, going from one tone to the next, and it's never quite sure what it's going for, whether it's a serious artsy drama about a psychologically damaged music student seeking the ultimate artistic expression, or whether it's a serial killer film about a super inventive jigsaw-style psychopath. Is our lead Alexis sympathetic? Is she crazy? What does she really want out of life? What does she hope to achieve by doing the weird shit she's doing? Well, I can promise you that Sound of Violence will answer none of those questions, and in a weird way, I kind of like it for that. It's not by any means a good film, but just one that's lodged itself into my mind in a weird way. I am not by any means going to defend Sound of Violence because it's laden with issues, but it's also got something unique about it that's just kind of entertaining at the end of the day. It is a super oddball one, but it is my 4th favourite film of May 2021, and my 19th favourite film of the year so far. Sound of Violence at 3 stars out of 5, just for its sheer weirdness. So next up, we've got the first of 3 films this month to make it into my top 10 of 2021 so far. Last month there was just one top 10er, which was The Haunted Hotel, and after including all this month's movies in my rankings of the year so far, that's been knocked all the way down to number 10. Just below my 3rd favourite movie this month, which is a big franchise movie, none other than Spiral from the Book of Saw, which got 3.5 stars from me. Spiral is a pretty solid film, although the less you compare it to the rest of the Saw franchise, the better it will look. It lacks a lot of the best things about the Saw series, Tobin Bell for example, but if looked at as a standalone gory police whodunit horror thriller, then Spiral's a slick and entertaining movie helmed by one of my favourite directors, Darren Lynn Bousman. A new Saw film is always great, but if the franchise isn't exactly your thing, then you're probably going to want to give Spiral a miss. It does try new things, but it is still basically a Saw film. No shame in that, which is why it is my 3rd favourite film of the month. So I was debating with myself a lot between numbers 2 and 3 this month because I think they're very different films, but of course I enjoyed both of them a lot, both landing in my top 10 of the year so far. After a lot of consideration, I decided that just above Spiral at number 2 for this month is Fried Barry. Whereas I said Sound of Violence was a mindfuck, Fried Barry is more like a gangbang. But the thing is that it's not just weird for its own sake, there's a genuine love of oddness in Fried Barry, of images just slightly askew, really weird people in a strange world that looks a lot like ours but is somehow this horribly distorted mirror image of the world that we live in. Though I'd probably rather rewatch Spiral than Fried Barry because Barry is such a strongly flavoured experience, I can respect Fried Barry more as a film because it's doing stuff I've never seen before. Essentially a variant on the Christ comes to Earth in modern times and gets fucked over because we're so fucked up as a society. Fried Barry is mesmerisingly strange, and though you might be too bowled over to appreciate it, it's got its own strange story to tell, and Gary Green as Barry is just such a fascinating specimen to want to build a film around. 4 stars for Fried Barry, which isn't the weirdo cult movie you might think it to be, but actually a very, very unique slice of South African insanity. So of course, if you've stuck with me this long, you can probably guess my number 1 film of the month. From Thailand, still available via Netflix, it's none other than Ghost Lab, a gut-wrenchingly human drama about a supernatural investigation that develops into something dark and terrifying. The characters are amazing, it's beautifully shot, it's got so many moments in it that make your spine tingle with shock that it's no surprise Ghost Lab got 4.5 stars from me. It's a really, really special film, clocking in at just under 2 hours. I don't think it ever feels dull or like the people making it were just going through the motions. It's invigorating, it's dynamic, and I loved it so much that it's currently my second favourite film of the year, sitting just below the legendary Come True, which I've now seen 3 times since March and I still think is a real classic. But Ghost Lab is a great piece of work and it really does manage to make you feel for its characters. To be honest, I think at this rate it will definitely stay in my top 10 of the year, and I'll no doubt revisit it before the end of the year. I'm planning to do a big kind of countdown video for the year, maybe a top 10 or a top however many video. I'd say that Ghost Lab will probably be in that video just because I'd had such a blast with it. It's such a shamelessly emotional, vibrant experience that I'd urge all of you to check it out if you get the chance. Don't be afraid of subtitles or the fact it's 2 hours long. It's well worth it and it 100% deserves the top spot this month as the best horror film of May 2021. So now we're going to move on to the monthly awards. This is a segment where I'm singling out for praise the best of the month in Oscars type fashion. So starting off, we've got the award for the best performance of the month. Weirdly, I don't think it's been that much of a great month for performances. Nothing too special's really stood out amongst the bottom kind of 3/4 of the list or so. I mean, I thought Chris Rock did a pretty decent job in Spiral for sure, but it wasn't really the best performance of the month, in my opinion. Therefore, it's a toss-up for me between the stars of my 2 top movies of the month, Gary Green as Barry in Fried Barry, or Thanapob Liratanak Acorn as Dr. Wee in Ghost Lab, and there's a name for you. It's tricky again to say who gave the better performance overall, as they're both incredibly different parts. One is full of emotion and life, and the other is totally alien and weird. I think, in the interest of fairness, as much as I did love Fried Barry himself, and really loved all his quirky mannerisms and uniqueness, I'm going to have to give the award for best performance to our good friend Thanapob Liratanak Acorn as Dr. Wee for breathing so much life into his character. Such a rich, vivid performance. I love the guy, doesn't put a foot wrong the whole time. A well-deserved win, I think. So next up we've got the award for the best soundtrack. Once again I'll mention very quickly that I think Ghost Lab had a great soundtrack that really sold its drama. Fried Barry also had a great weird kind of synthy score from South African artist Hazer, which did great stuff as well. Personally, I think the track Fried Homecoming Part 1 I think is really special, and whilst there are a lot of great cues on the soundtrack album, there's also a lot of that kind of dissonant weird stuff that doesn't come off so well as a musical listening experience, but does work in the film. I think it's once again no surprise where this award is going, and it is of course to the man himself, Charlie Clouser, for his score to to Spiral from the Book of Saw, which is another amazing Saw universe score from one of the very best soundtrack composers in the business today. It's a little bit lower key than some of his Saw stuff, but Spiral is still a great soundtrack. As I said, Wax Angie and B Partners are my personal favourites, but the whole score manages to use the musical vocabulary for the Saw series that Charlie Clouser created all those years ago and managed to spin it out into something fresh that uses those familiar themes sparingly. It's a great industrial mainstream action horror soundtrack. Big, awesomely produced, and I love it. By far the best of the month, although Fried Barry is pretty cool as well. Now we've got maybe the least significant award to give out, which is the award for Best Title, or as it's also known, the award for choosing the best group of words to call your film. I'm always fascinated by titles just because I think that great titles are a dying art, especially in the horror genre. This month, a lot of the best films have got pretty weak titles. Ghost Lab, Fried Barry, even Sound of Violence, and as I said in my review, Spiral from the Book of Saw is just a fucking abortion of a title. Therefore I think that with an honourable mention to the pulpy but simple Army of the Dead, the best title this month is going to find its way to the Full Moon effort Don't Let Her In, just because it's got that great don't at the start, and because it's punchy, it's got a nice vibe to it. It is a pretty pointless award, but anyway, thumbs up to Don't Let Her In as the best title of the month. So now it's time for the award of biggest surprise of the month, of course being a film that I had no expectations for whatsoever, one that wasn't even on my radar that I just shoved on and was not for 6 by. Because I'm not sure exactly what I do think of Sound of Violence quite genuinely, I'm not going to include that. I was sort of aware of Fried Barry quite a bit and was pleasantly surprised by the fact that it wasn't the film that I thought it was going to be. But I think for the third time in a row, I'm going to have to just cop out and say that my biggest surprise of the month was of course my number one movie, which in this case was Ghost Lab, which I genuinely didn't have any expectations for, wasn't even particularly aware of it, didn't look up anything about it or that, just shoved it on because it was on Netflix, and holy shit was that one of the happiest coincidences ever. Ghost Lab, amazing film, and of course my biggest surprise of the month. And with the biggest surprise comes the biggest disappointment, the award for the film with which I was the most let down. It's an interesting one, this, because it assumes a certain degree of interest and expectation on my part. Much as I want to say Army of the Dead, for example, I would be lying if I said I ever thought it would be any good, given its combination of stuff I don't like, Zack Snyder, bang bang action, zombies and so on. Rink wasn't as good as I thought it would be, but it was still enjoyable enough. Therefore, I think what I'm going to have to do is to give this award to a film that started off well, thereby luring me into thinking it would be good, before fucking me over with a shitty ending. The Djinn certainly fits that mould, but I'm going to give the award instead to the film Antidote, just for backing down and being as cowardly as fuck. Had a great premise, could have been really, really good, but ended up as a lame, shitty cop-out, or to put it another way, it was officially the biggest disappointment of May 2021. Fuck that film and its crappy ending. I still would like to see, though, a legit version done using this film's basic idea that totally just jettisons all the crappy twists and just plays out the human lab rat thing. I think that would be pretty good. So with that out of the way, all that remains is for me to give the award for Best Director of the month, and as much as I love Darren Lynn Bousman's work, and though I think Spiral is a really good film, it's once again a toss-up between the big two, Ryan Kruger, director of Fried Barry, and the director of Ghost Lab, Paween Purajit Panya, and as much as I loved all the quirkiness and the unique eye for an image that Ryan Kruger displayed, he is sadly in the shade of the amazing talents of Mr. Paween Purajit Panya, who really just made one of the most stylish and memorable films I've seen for a long time. The guy is a huge talent for sure, and more than just being the director of a great film, I think he is an awesome director. His style and approach are writ large over every single frame of Ghost Lab. This is absolutely a film that has been auteured by the talents of a visionary filmmaker, and I'm happy to give him the award for the Best Director of the month. Well, that finishes us off for now for the awards, and that's pretty much us all finished now, apart from just to get a quick look at the monthly average, which is where we take the average rating for a film this month and compare it to our averages from previous months, in an effort to kind of plot out a trajectory for the year so far. Obviously it's not an exact science, in a lot of cases it comes down to just how wide I want to cast the net when it comes to picking what to watch. There are always more horror films each month than I ever realistically get a chance to see, but in a lot of cases I'll make the decision not not to watch something for whatever reason. Watching bad films will bring your average down, and in a lot of cases you can tell the kind of films that will not be good. Stuff like The Tooth Fairy, The Last Extraction, for example. That's the kind of film that's never going to be getting an above average rating. The great films, though, that's kind of harder to tell. Trial and error and experimentation is a lot of the fun of the process, and a high average rating ultimately just means that I've decided to be more cautious with what I watch. In this case, the path so far has been that March came in at 5.3 out of 10 out of 16 films watched, and April sank down to 4.1 out of 10 out of 20 films in April. So basically, the more films you watch, presumably the lower the average will be. This month, with only 14 films watched, there's no 1 stars and there are 3 top teners. The monthly average for May 2021 is 4.9 out of 10, a good 8% up from last month, but lower than the high of March, where we had 3 4-star and above rated films. In order to beat that, we're going to have to get a good run of really solid films, and hopefully no 1-star lowers to drag things down. Hopefully things will be looking up now as we head into the summer. There are certainly a good few things to look forward to coming out soon, and hopefully I will find plenty of more hidden gems along the way too. So I guess that wraps things up for this month. All that's left to say is that if you're listening to this, thank you very much for your support. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Any feedback or thoughts are welcome. Hopefully the next one won't be so late, and I'll get back on track for the next episode of The Month in Horror. Thank you for listening, y'all. My name is Alex. Stay morbid, everybody, and good night to one and all.